1985 was a devastating year for American intelligence, so much so that it was dubbed the Year of the Spy. 14 Americans were arrested that year on charges of espionage, and those were just the ones who were caught. From the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and the Navy, American intelligence institutions were thoroughly compromised. The majority of these men and women spied for the Soviet Union. The communist behemoth, only 6 years away from its undoing, remained the greatest enemy and chief rival of the United States of America. It is perhaps for this reason that someone like the subject of today's video managed to sail undetected for more than 3 decades, spying on behalf of a sleeping giant in the Far East. He moved unseen, feeding his handlers information that greatly helped the Communist Party of China to identify traitors and inform its US foreign policy. He was a scholar and a brilliant linguist. He was unassuming and perceived as a loyal, hard-working employee. It was these traits that made him, as some would claim, the perfect spy. Larry Wu-Tai Chin was born Jin Wu-Dai on the 17th of August 1922 in Peking to a moderately wealthy family. We then pick up the story in 1943 when a 21-year-old Larry was a student at the prestigious Yenching University studying languages and economics. He was evidently a good student and had already become fluent in English. It was this skill and his proficiency in 3 Chinese dialects that saw him recruited first for the British military mission and then the US Army as a translator and interpreter during World War II. When he returned to university to complete his studies, his campus had become a hotbed of communist activity. Larry's roommate was a man by the name of Mr. Wang. The 2 men would spend hours in deep conversation discussing the politics of the day and their future career prospects. Larry and Mr. Wang found common ground in their sadness at seeing the deterioration of Chinese-American relations. Mr. Wang suggested to Larry that he use his linguistic talents to help restore diplomacy between the 2 countries. If only someone could help to interpret American attitudes and foster greater understanding between the 2 great nations, Larry could definitely be that person. To this end, Mr. Wang introduced Larry to a man whom he was told was a communist security officer responsible for monitoring American officials. This man encouraged Larry to apply for a job at the US consulate in Shanghai after he graduated from university. He was told to simply keep his eyes and ears open and to see what he could learn. And so this is exactly what he did. In 1948, Larry started work at the US consulate where his linguistic talents soon saw him appointed as the lead translator. The following year, in 1949, he married his first wife, Doris Chu, with whom he would have 3 children. In May of 1950, and after the communist victory over the US-backed nationalist government in the Chinese Civil War, Larry was transferred to Hong Kong when the US consulate was forced to move out of mainland China. When the Korean War broke out the following month in June of 1950, Larry was deployed by the US State Department to work with the US Army services as a translator and interpreter. His primary role was to assist in the interrogation of Chinese prisoners of war who had fought alongside Kim Il-sung's North Korean army. It was during this time that Larry began meeting with a man named Dr. Wang, who's not to be confused with Larry's former university roommate, Mr. Wang. Larry shared information with Dr. Wang about the prisoner interrogations he participated in. Initially, the information he provided was very basic, ranging from the food the prisoners were served to their living conditions and US interrogation methods. As the weeks progressed, Larry started providing more personal information about those interrogated. He identified prisoners who remained loyal to China and those who were not. As a result, thousands that were released from the POW camps after the war found themselves in prison camps back in China for thought re-education. An unknown number of others were executed outright. The first reward Larry received for sharing this information came in the form of payment of 2,000 Hong Kong dollars. This was a small drop in the ocean, but the money whet his appetite for more. Larry became a compulsive gambler and frequented the seediest of Hong Kong strip clubs. He had expensive vices, and he knew he had found a way to finance them. When the Korean armistice was signed in 1953, ending combat in the Korean War, Larry was ready to move on to his next assignment. He moved with his wife Doris and 2 young children to Okinawa, Japan, where he took up employment with the US's Foreign Broadcast Information Service, or FBIS. Operating from the Kadena Air Base, the FBIS was in fact a division of the CIA and was chiefly responsible for translating Chinese radio broadcasts and other media into English. Larry's work was critical to US intelligence, as these broadcasts were virtually the only window the Western world had into Chinese intentions on key geopolitical issues such as Korea and Taiwan. It was while working for the FBIS that Larry's relationship with his handler, Dr. Wang, came to an end. Replacing Dr. Wang was O Chi-ming, an agent of the Chinese Ministry of State Security, who was known to Larry only as Mr. O. Larry's position offered him insight into what the CIA was most interested in, judging by the content of the broadcasts he was required to translate. While he didn't have access to top-secret information, the intelligence he was gathering was of a different sort, the kind that allowed Chinese intelligence to gauge US sentiment towards reported happenings in mainland China. Armed with this knowledge, the Chinese could choose to either restrict press coverage of certain events and issues or spread misinformation on those topics. While this doesn't seem like very much, the collection of this sort of information was a key part of Chinese intelligence gathering. The difference between the methods and objectives of Chinese intelligence compared to the Soviet Union and America could not have been more stark. Where the Soviets and Americans came in like a raging bull in a china shop, the Chinese approach was long, slow, and pervasive, almost imperceptible. Where the Americans and Soviets were heavy-handed and direct, the Chinese were subtle and cautious. The Soviets, like their American counterparts, relied on a small number of individuals to produce highly selective intelligence. The Chinese, on the other hand, operated by flooding America with people from all walks of life. From students and scientists to businessmen and émigrés, the Chinese relied on large numbers of people to produce small quantities of intelligence. It was this cautious approach that allowed Larry to operate with relative ease. Working from Japan presented some difficulties for Larry that he had up to that point not yet experienced. He was no longer in Hong Kong, where meeting with his handler was low risk, and travel to the mainland was easy. The Chinese methods of espionage called always for in-person meetings. Since his work was a slow burn, he would meet with Mr. O in Hong Kong at least once a year for a briefing session. This he did for the next 8 years while living at the airbase. As the 1950s were drawing to a close, Larry was offered a new golden opportunity. He was about to be on his way to live in the United States of America. In January 1961, Larry was transferred to work at the FBIS Bureau in Santa Rosa, California. His work was essentially the same, to translate Chinese radio broadcasts into English based on the CIA's classified intelligence requirements. Larry continued to feed information back to his handlers, the true value of which was for the Chinese to either confirm or refute intelligence that they had already procured through other sources. Given that Larry was now operating from within the heart of America, contingencies had to be put in place for his continuing operation as a spy. He was given the phone number of one Mr. Lee, who lived in Toronto. While he continued to make trips to Hong Kong every few years to be debriefed by Mr. O, it was far easier for Larry to cross the undefended border between the USA and Canada to deliver his intelligence. Another of his new contacts was a Catholic priest living in New York named Father Mark Chung. If Larry found himself compromised and needed to make a quick exit, he was to meet with Father Chung in the confessional booth at the Church of Transfiguration. Larry had divorced from his wife Doris in 1959 before arriving in America and commenced a new relationship with Chow Chin Yu, known also as Kathy, whom he met while working in Japan. Larry and Kathy were married in Reno on the 5th of August 1963, and in 1965, Larry Chin became a naturalized US citizen. Not only was Larry extremely proficient at his job, he was also charming and popular among his colleagues. His knowledge of Chinese culture and social norms and expertise in various dialects made him the go-to person for anybody in the intelligence community needing to communicate in Chinese. He always received glowing performance appraisals. For the next 5 years, Larry continued his work for the FBIS in Santa Rosa. When the West Coast branch was shuttered, Larry was offered a position at FBIS headquarters in Roslyn, Virginia. As the 1970s dawned, Larry was heading to the heart of US intelligence, which is exactly where his handlers wanted him. Since he was going to now become a fully fledged employee of the CIA as an analyst and a translator, Larry Chin was subject to a routine but extensive background check. No information could be gleaned from the 28 years he spent living in China. However, the 20 years worth of history that could be uncovered from his life in Hong Kong and since moving to America revealed nothing untoward. A polygraph test likewise raised no red flags. Larry listened slowly as the questions were posed to him first in English, then translated into Chinese. Of course, he could understand both languages. It wasn't long before Larry was granted a top-secret security clearance and was settling into his new role working directly for the CIA. Larry was responsible for the bulk of the translation duties for Chinese material and communications. To do his job, he was often given complete access to top-secret US intelligence reports. He was able to profile both the CIA officers he worked with and the agents they were communicating with in the East. When translating communications, Larry would ask about the recipient's age, gender, level of education, local dialect, and other personal details. All this information Larry would pass on to Chinese public security. These details resulted in the compromise of an untold number of American informants and agents. We can only speculate as to their fates. Larry was only a few months into his new job when a top-secret document came across his desk that would not only determine his future as China's most valuable asset, but would also play a role in determining the geopolitical landscape for the immediate future. For 20 years, and since the Chinese Communist Party had seized power, the doors of diplomacy between the US and China had remained firmly shut. When Richard Nixon was sworn into office as US President in January of 1969, the first signs of a shifting in attitudes could be seen. Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, were secretly planning a first diplomatic mission to China. The top-secret report held in Larry Wu-Tai Chin's hands detailed the so-called Nixon-Kissinger opening toward China and US plans to visit the country. Larry knew he had struck gold. He quickly photographed the report and immediately contacted Mr. Lee in Toronto via payphone. He then traveled to Canada via New York, where he handed over the microfilm containing the secret report. That roll of microfilm was sent back to China, developed and printed, and eventually made its way to the desk of Mao Zedong himself. Thus, in 1971, when Kissinger began to discuss plans for the US president to visit China, the Chinese had advance warning of US intentions and were receptive. On the 17th of February 1972, US President Richard Nixon stepped off Air Force One at the Beijing airport with hand outstretched. Nixon later declared that as he shook hands with Zhou Enlai, the premier of the CCP, one era ended and another began. Nixon's trip was a resounding success. He even declared it the week that changed the world. The restoration of relations between the US and China also served a dual purpose, straining China's ties with the Soviet Union. Larry Chin's espionage in this case had the result of strengthening US-Chinese relations, a goal which had got him involved in spying in the first place. Back in China, Larry was regarded a hero for his role in advancing Sino-American relations. For the next 9 years, Larry continued his spying work, flying regularly to Toronto and occasionally to Hong Kong to meet with his handlers to pass on more information. In all, Larry Chin received approximately $180,000 from the Chinese government for his work, which is approximately $1.2 million in today's money. This second income stream opened up a whole new world for Larry. Expensive restaurants, vacations, women, and gambling were the order of the day. These last two were vices that proved irresistible to Larry. He continued to frequent strip clubs and gambled away huge sums of money at the blackjack tables at casinos in Atlantic City and Las Vegas. Yet he managed to keep this aspect of his personal life mostly a secret from his employer. He was discreet with his wealth, and when any colleague happened to notice that he was living beyond his means, he managed to explain this away as casino winnings. What he didn't lose at the casino, Larry Chin used to invest in real estate, amassing for himself a property portfolio worth $700,000 spanning Baltimore, Washington, and Las Vegas. He also maintained a bank account in Hong Kong in which he stashed away a nest egg of $200,000. After a long and illustrious career, Larry retired from his position at the CIA in January of 1981. He was awarded the Intelligence Medal for the service to his country over the decades. He didn't tell his Chinese handlers that he had retired, as he wanted to maintain his status as their prized agent. He still made trips to Hong Kong, where he fed back information he was able to glean from staying in contact with his old colleagues. He would call his former office mates and friends ostensibly to catch up on news, but in reality, he was sussing out who was working in which department and who was assigned to different cases. On the 4th of February 1982, Larry made a decision that would set in motion his undoing. He flew to Beijing to attend a banquet held to honor him for his work for Chinese intelligence. There he was awarded the honorary rank of Deputy Bureau Chief in the Ministry of Public Security. He thus joined the rare ranks of those decorated by both sides in an intelligence war. He was also given a golden parachute of $40,000. Life was good for Larry Chin. Yet little did he know that an official working for the Chinese Ministry of Public Security had been secretly working with the CIA as an informant. This man was about to defect to the USA and lift the lid on Larry's decades-long spying spree. Codenamed Plainsman by the CIA, Yu Changshong was a walk-in, a defector that made first contact with the USA unsolicited to offer his services. Volunteers like this are always treated with circumspection due to the high chance of a dangle operation, and details surrounding Yu Changshong's decision to betray his country are unclear. Speculations as to his motives range from political disillusionment to money. While still in China, Yu Changshong tipped off the CIA about a Chinese mole within the ranks of American intelligence. He didn't know the name of the man, but said that the mole had flown to Beijing in February of 1982. The CIA spent 6 months evaluating this tip-off, not wanting to involve the FBI if it didn't need to, and always, of course, not wanting to admit that it may have a spy within its own ranks. It was only on the 28th of September 1982 that the CIA determined that there was likely some truth to the matter, and only then passed on the information to the FBI. It was on this day that a report landed on the desk of FBI Special Agent R.C. Smith. Conveniently for the CIA, the report said that the mole was likely in the FBI or the military. Agent Smith assembled his team in anticipation of an extensive mole hunt, assigning Special Agent Tom Carson to investigate. Carson opened a new file, which due to the lack of information, he simply labeled UNSUB, short for unknown subject. He wasn't going to exclude anyone from the ambit of his search, certainly not the whole of the CIA, on the basis of their say-so alone. All he knew was that the suspect was a Chinese male who had traveled to Beijing to meet with his spy masters to be honored at a banquet. The tip-off from Yu Changshong contained 2 key inaccuracies that sent FBI investigators on a wild goose chase for nearly a year. Yu said that the spy had flown on a Pan Am flight to Beijing and that he was a current employee within American intelligence. In reality, Larry Chin had recently retired. Chinese intelligence just didn't know it. And he had flown on China's national carrier, CAAC, not Pan Am. Special Agent Tom Carson quickly established that there had been no Pan Am flight to leave for Beijing on the 6th of February. He nevertheless spent weeks scouring the airline's records to no avail. Once he realized his time was being spent in vain, the FBI decided to widen its search by listening in to hours' worth of telephone conversations recorded through surveillance of the Chinese U.S. Embassy. By January of 1983, Special Agent Tom Carson was about to lose hope. Then, he stumbled upon a recording of a telephone conversation on the 5th of February 1982. This was just one day prior to the date on which their mole had flown to Beijing. The call had been made by a Chinese official at JFK Airport to the Chinese embassy. He called to let his office know that his flight to China had been delayed by a snowstorm. No American federal employee would ever have been authorized to fly on a Chinese airline, but if the flight had been arranged by Chinese intelligence, well, it was entirely possible that the mole had been on that particular flight. Carson wasn't able to get a passenger list from the CAAC flight, but plainsman's tip-off also said that the mole had flown back into the US on the 27th of February 1982. Checking flight records, he saw that CAAC Flight 983 had landed at the San Francisco International Airport on the date in question. He rushed to request a passenger list from Customs. Among the names were 4 passengers who were American citizens, but one Chinese-sounding name in particular stood out from the rest. The address provided by this passenger was in a suburb in Washington that was home to a large community of federal employees. Running this name through the FBI database brought up a match confirming that this passenger had been subject to a background check and had a security clearance. Carson immediately contacted the CIA to check whether he was one of their employees. No, they said, but he used to be. While all circumstantial, the evidence pointed to Larry Wu-Tai Chin as being unsub. He then became the FBI's prime suspect. Tom Carson and his team immediately started combing through every document that ever crossed Larry's desk in the 3 decades that he worked for the CIA. Yet he came up with nothing. There was no direct evidence whatsoever to indicate that Larry had been acting as a double agent. Had Larry Chin still been employed by the CIA, the plan would have been to put him to the test, bug his office with hidden cameras, provide him with falsified information that nobody else had access to, and then see whether it landed up in the hands of the Chinese. Of course, with Larry having retired, this was not going to be possible. Without being caught in the act, investigating and then prosecuting Larry Chin was going to be a very difficult task. It was decided that the FBI's best bet was to attempt to lure Larry back into the fold as a consultant. Despite being offered a handsome reward for his services, Larry refused after he was told that he would need to sit another polygraph exam to restore his security clearance. His excuse was that he was too busy with his work with his alma mater at Yencheng University. The FBI had no option at that point but to simply wait and watch. On the 13th of April 1985, a warrant was granted for the FBI to install telephone and microphone surveillance in Larry Chin's apartment. For the next 2 years, 2 FBI special agents fluent in Chinese listened in to every conversation Larry had. They inspected Larry's post to identify possible contacts through return addresses and postmarks, but their warrant did not authorize the opening of his mail. While listening in to his telephone conversations, investigators learned of a darker, previously unknown side to the man adored by his American colleagues and bosses. Larry routinely engaged in phone sex calls with women he referred to as his nieces. His conduct was so bad that FBI investigators would go on to describe Larry as a lecherous scumbag. One day, an incident occurred between Larry and a teenage girl in the laundry room of the residential complex in which he lived. This led to a charge of assault being laid against Larry, which was later dropped. As a result of this, the Chin family moved out of their home to another apartment. This meant that the FBI had to reapply for a warrant, resulting in a few weeks' delay to the investigation. And it wasn't long before Larry again found himself in trouble, allegedly grabbing at a teenage girl as she rode her bicycle past him. No charges were laid following this incident. Eventually, the FBI thought they were onto something when they heard Larry speaking to a woman from Chicago in which he requested that she bring the machine. Agents were disappointed to learn that Larry Chin was describing a sex toy and not some gadget he intended to use to commit espionage. Larry Chin's marriage to his second wife was on shaky ground. Kathy knew of his sexual escapades and actively tried to prevent him from being unfaithful. On one occasion, Larry knocked Kathy to the ground when she tried to block him from leaving in his vehicle to meet with his mistress. Larry's marital woes saw him move out of his apartment into another unit next door. The FBI was again required to apply for their surveillance warrant, delaying the investigation by a further few weeks. In June of 1983, the FBI received a tip-off from plainsmen that Larry was planning a trip to Hong Kong and then Macau. Surely he intended to meet his Chinese handler, and this was the FBI's opportunity to catch him red-handed. The difficulties inherent in American intelligence conducting operations in communist China meant that Tom Carson's request to follow Larry to Hong Kong was declined by the CIA. The FBI nevertheless tailed Larry to Dulles Airport and intercepted his luggage as it passed through baggage handling before being loaded onto the plane. Searching through the bag, the FBI came up with nothing unusual except for a mysterious key marked with Chinese characters and the number 533. As it turned out, this was a key for hotel room number 533 at the Chengmin Hotel in Beijing, a venue known to be a hotspot for intelligence activity. But the key alone was not any smoking gun evidence. As such, the FBI were powerless to do anything to prevent Larry from leaving the US. Operation Eagle Claw was grinding to a halt. For 2 years, investigators had been searching but had not been able to find any direct evidence of Larry Wu-Tai Chin having committed an act of espionage. With their key source, plainsmen, being safe within the USA after defecting, the FBI decided Larry Chin would need to be confronted. It was hoped that interviewers could bring enough pressure to bear on Larry for him to confess. An interview team was assembled, and FBI agents knocked on Larry Chin's door on the 22nd of November 1985. They asked if they could have a friendly conversation with him regarding a possible leak to the Chinese intelligence service. Whether it was curiosity or hubris, Larry agreed to let the men inside to answer their questions. Sitting at his dining room table, Larry remained stone-faced when he was told the mole had been active within the CIA during the 1970s and 1980s. The questions asked by the agents elicited little response, and so they decided to turn the heat up. Risking years of prior work and investigation, they laid it all out on the table before Larry, telling him that they knew about his trips to Toronto and Hong Kong, and that they knew he was a spy. Larry's initial response was denial, but when the FBI agents told them about the key to hotel room number 533, cracks began to appear in Larry's confident demeanor. "How do I know you aren't bluffing?" he is reported to have asked. The FBI agents then threw down their final gambit, telling Larry that they knew about his previous trip to Hong Kong in September 1983, where he met with Ho Chi Minh and had asked for $150,000 to aid him in settling matters in his divorce from his wife Kathy. At hearing this, Larry Chin knew that his number was up. There was only one other person in the world who knew those details, and he faced the sudden realization that his handler, Mr. O, had either been compromised or had defected to the USA. He knew he had no chance of escape, and thus decided to cooperate with investigators. Operation Eagle Claw was successfully brought to a close on the 23rd of November 1985 with the arrest of Larry Wu-Tai Chin. The embarrassment felt by American intelligence was acute. Larry Chin was yet another mole uncovered in the disastrous year of the spy that was 1985. It was essential to US state prosecutors that Larry Chin be brought to justice, and quickly. Between the 4th and 7th of February 1986, Larry's case was heard in the Federal Court of Alexandria in Virginia. One of the major charges against Larry was the time he spent spying for China during the Korean War. Prosecutors framed it as follows. Here was a clear act that damaged the national security of the United States in the midst of a military conflict. Americans were dying, and Larry was spying. In his defense, Larry Chin testified that he had passed classified information to the Chinese only as part of a personal mission to overcome Chinese paranoia and to help reconcile historic differences between China and the United States. This was never going to be enough of a defense. On the strength of his confession and the evidence led at trial, the jury found the 63-year-old guilty on 17 counts of espionage, tax evasion, conspiracy, and failing to report foreign financial and gold transactions. Larry Wu-Tai Chin was sentenced to an astonishing 133 years in prison and fined $3.3 million. Facing the rest of his life behind bars, on the 21st of February 1986, Larry Chin committed suicide in his cell, suffocating himself with a plastic bag that he tied tight around his neck using his shoelaces. A CIA source later said that during a visit from the Chinese consul, Larry was told that so long as he died without revealing any of his secrets, his family would be taken care of. Prior to his untimely end, Larry was preparing for a full debriefing with the CIA. As the debriefing never took place, a full damage assessment could not be undertaken, and US intelligence was never able to establish the full extent of the harm that Larry may have caused. While Larry Chin may have started his spying journey many decades earlier with the naive goal of mediating relations between the USA and China, these noble ambitions played second fiddle to his desire for wealth. This episode served as a rude awakening to US intelligence of the threat of espionage from Communist China. Given the access Larry Chin had to raw intelligence in the course of his work, the CIA and FBI had to assume that there was almost nothing that the Chinese had not seen. This caused a shift in focus, with US intelligence agencies realizing that for far too long they had neglected China, being so focused on the Soviet bloc. At the dawn of the new millennium, Chinese espionage against the USA quickly eclipsed the height of Soviet collection efforts during the Cold War, and thus fresh battle lines were drawn, setting the stage for a new kind of intelligence war. In October 1971, American nuclear-powered submarine USS Halibut slipped into the frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk. Navy divers emerged from the vessel, descending 400 feet below the water's surface where they located their target, an undersea communications cable transmitting mostly unencrypted messages between two key Soviet naval bases. The divers proceeded to attach a 20-foot-long recording device to the cable. Once they completed their mission, they returned to the Halibut, which shrunk back into the shadowy depths of the sea. For the next 10 years, American intelligence listened in to all Soviet communications transmitted along the cable. Considered by many as the most important intelligence-gathering operation of the Cold War, the US learned of Soviet submarine and missile technology, its state of military preparedness, and its nuclear first strike capabilities. But then suddenly in 1980, the messages stopped. Operation Ivy Bells, a joint Navy, NSA, and CIA operation, was over. That the undersea wiretap had been discovered by the Soviets by chance was highly unlikely. The compromise of Operation Ivy Bells must have been an inside job. It would only be years later that American intelligence would discover the man behind the compromise. The National Security Agency prides itself in being the chief collector and protector of US and international signals intelligence. Yet, as closely as it guards its secrets, the NSA learned the hard way that it is not immune to betrayal from within. Enter Ronald W. Pelton. Born in 1941 in Benton Harbor, Michigan, Pelton journeyed from an ordinary, outwardly patriotic American citizen to a notorious Cold War spy and traitor.
He was just one among many Americans nabbed during the infamous Year of the Spy in 1985. Throughout his schooling, Ronald Pelton was a good student, graduating in the top quarter of his class in high school. He then joined the US Air Force, where he spent 4 years working as an intelligence analyst at American bases in Texas and then Pakistan. He demonstrated an aptitude for languages, and given the ongoing Cold War, put his talents to good use by taking a Russian language course. Pelton was discharged from the Navy in 1964 and moved back to his hometown, where he lived an ordinary middle-class life as a TV repairman. That same year, Ronald married a woman by the name of Judith, and together they had their first child. Pelton's linguistic and analytical talents were, however, such that in 1965 he was drawn back into the world of intelligence, being recruited that year by the National Security Agency. He worked a civilian role specializing in operations against the Soviet Union. Although he showed signs of early promise and was evidently a clever analyst, he was considered immature and arrogant by his colleagues, having an ego which he couldn't control. While assigned to work in the United Kingdom between 1966 and 1972, Pelton was reprimanded by his superiors after it was found out that he broke into a casino slot machine and made off with the equivalent of $13.50. It also came to light that he was having an affair with the wife of one of his NSA colleagues, resulting in the wife and the colleague being sent back to the USA. Despite working 14 years for the NSA, Ronald Pelton never managed to rise very high in the organization. Although he earned a respectable middle-class annual income of $24,500, Pelton then had a wife and 4 children to support. Ever the schemer and a borderline spendthrift, the seams of Pelton's personal life began to split as the 1970s drew to a close. By the end of the 1970s, Ronald Pelton was facing a predicament. He was in dire financial straits after running up large debts in a home building project. The new home he planned for his family saw massive cost overruns, thanks in part, Pelton claimed, to the theft of building materials from the construction site. Drowning in debt, Pelton filed for bankruptcy in 1979. He feared that his financial status might jeopardize his security clearance and thus his job at the NSA. Doubting that he would be able to pass his next routine polygraph examination, Pelton chose to retire from the NSA rather than face an embarrassing exit. After leaving the NSA in July 1979, he took up a job as a salesman for a boat builder in Annapolis, a far cry from his former career in high-stakes intelligence work. His dreams of getting rich selling yachts were, however, unfulfilled. He barely managed to eke out a living, and with just a few $100s in his bank account and facing a mountain of debt, Ronald Pelton started to scheme. Although he was officially out of the intelligence game, he knew that his country's chief enemy and rival, the Soviet Union, would pay well for the NSA secrets he still retained in his head. Ronald Pelton is said to have had a photographic memory, and he could recall in vivid detail all the NSA secrets he had become privy to. From joint covert operations to what the US knew and what it didn't know about Russian ciphers and encrypted communications. Desperate for cash, Pelton made a fateful phone call to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. on the 14th of January 1980. He stammered his way through telling the person on the line that he worked for the American government. With that, he was invited to a meeting at the embassy, which was agreed would take place the next night under cover of darkness. As it so happened, the FBI was listening in to his phone call via a wiretap on the embassy's phone lines. Nobody recognized the caller's voice, but as they always maintained eyes on the Soviet embassy, the FBI hoped to get a visual on their would-be traitor when he visited the next night. The FBI was, however, taken by surprise when at 2:32 p.m., the mystery traitor called the embassy again, saying that he would be there within the next 2 minutes. The FBI agents on duty that day scrambled to catch a glimpse of the man, but were unable to get a positive ID, as they only saw his back as the man slipped in behind embassy gates. Once inside the embassy, Pelton talked with Vitaly Yurchenko, a KGB officer in charge of embassy security. From that moment, the two men's fates would be forever intertwined. Yurchenko introduced himself to the squat, red-haired American man using an alias. After sussing him out with some preliminary questions, Yurchenko determined that the self-proclaimed former NSA employee was worth talking to. Yurchenko went upstairs to call his boss, Station Chief and KGB Colonel Viktor Cherkashin. He told him that there was a man downstairs wanting to trade NSA secrets for cash. Ronald Pelton didn't mince his words or try to hide his intentions. He made it clear that he wanted to make some money. His transparency was a key factor that led the KGB to believe that Pelton, a classic walk-in or volunteer spy, was genuine and not a CIA dangle. After answering further questions put to him by Yurchenko, the KGB decided to put their trust in the man. As his initial debriefing that day at the embassy drew to its close, the KGB had to figure out a way to get Pelton out the building without being seen. They were well aware that the Soviet embassy was under constant FBI surveillance, so walking out the front door wasn't an option. At the time, the Soviets were undertaking a renovation project at the embassy building. The carpenters, plumbers, and fitters doing the work were all, at great expense, flown in by the Soviets from Russia to avoid hiring Americans. They couldn't be too careful in avoiding the possibility of the FBI planting a spy among the ranks of the tradesmen. It was thus decided that Pelton would stay the night at the embassy and leave with one of the construction crews the next morning. On the 15th of January 1980, freshly shaven and wearing painter's overalls, Pelton slipped out the rear exit of the embassy with a group of workers. He was taken with the other men to a Soviet-owned property in Washington, and from there, driven to and dropped off outside a busy shopping mall. And just like that, Ronald Pelton had given the FBI the slip and was an active Soviet spy. For the next 5 years, Pelton would reveal to the KGB everything he could remember relating to NSA techniques, targets, and intercepts. He would meet with his KGB handler at various public locations around Washington, from restaurants to shopping centers. Although Pelton was no longer an active NSA employee, the KGB placed high value on the intelligence he was able to share, even flying him to Vienna on at least 2 occasions, which was the so-called espionage capital of the world, where for hours on end he unloaded a treasure trove of NSA secrets. The information Pelton betrayed to the KGB related primarily to NSA signals intelligence operations and capabilities. It is believed that he compromised Project Vortex, which was a type of spy satellite developed by the USA in the 1980s. It was designed to operate from high Earth orbit to intercept radio transmissions from Earth or space. However, the most valuable information that Pelton gave to the Soviets was the existence of Operation Ivy Bells. The hugely costly operation to install a telephone tap on the Soviet undersea cable in the Sea of Okhotsk provided America with important insight into Soviet military planning and procedures, including the movements of the Soviet naval fleet and advance warning of missile tests and military exercises planned to take place in the Far East. The Soviets, in their hubris, transmitted much of their communication unencrypted, being overly confident in the security of their undersea line. But all good things must come to an end, and in the case of Operation Ivy Bells, this was thanks to Ronald Pelton. Although the operation ran successfully for 10 years, in 1981, American satellites spotted Soviet ships, including a salvage vessel, anchored over the tap site. The game was up. When an American ship was dispatched a few months later to recover the device, it had vanished, hauled up by the Soviets after being tipped off by Pelton. The compromise of Operation Ivy Bells not only put a stop to the gathering by America of valuable signals intelligence, but also scuppered future expansion plans. Every 6 months, Navy frogmen had to return to the recording device to retrieve the pods containing the taped radio communications. Had the operation continued, the NSA planned to replace the recorders with an always-online system that didn't require the tapes to be changed, which was always a risky exercise. Pelton's clandestine meetings and exchanges of information for cash with the KGB went on for a full 5 years, with Pelton receiving payments totaling $35,000 US. This sum of money was hardly going to cover the sort of comfy retirement Pelton envisaged for himself, let alone cover his debts. As he continued to spy, his personal and financial life crumbled ever further. He had separated from his wife Judith and had become estranged from his 4 children. In 1984, Pelton started a relationship with Anne Barry, a green-eyed former Miss Maryland beauty contestant whom he met in a bar one night. Sometimes he stayed at her apartment, other nights he slept on a boat or couch surfed. The couple, brought together by their drinking, continued to party hard together, which included dabbling in recreational drug use. With his personal life circling the drain, Pelton had no idea that events across the Iron Curtain were about to spell his doom. The KGB security officer that Pelton first met when he presented himself at the Soviet embassy went on to climb the ranks of Soviet intelligence, becoming a colonel in the KGB. At the height of his career, Vitaly Yurchenko was the deputy chief of the first department within the first chief directorate. This was the Soviet equivalent of the CIA and was the KGB unit responsible for overseas espionage. The first department oversaw and directed spies within the USA and Canada. In other words, he was a big deal, rated by the CIA as the KGB's number 5 man. And so you can imagine the surprise of the CIA when in August 1985, Yurchenko sauntered into the American embassy while on assignment in Rome. There he offered to defect to the West. Hardly able to believe their luck, it was difficult to understand why a man so ensconced in the upper echelons of the KGB leadership would defect. There have been various theories proffered for Yurchenko's motivation, including that he was frustrated with the Soviet system and wanted to escape a troubled family life back home. Another factor was that a former mistress with whom he had had an affair while in Russia had relocated to Canada. Yurchenko had intentions to rekindle the love affair. He was quickly whisked back to the United States, where he was given a fully furnished home, $1 million in cash, and a salary exceeding $60,000 a year. In a safe house in Northern Virginia, Yurchenko was subjected to a rigorous joint debriefing undertaken by the CIA and the FBI. The interviews would stretch over the next 3 months. Among the secrets he divulged was the presence of 2 moles within the ranks of American intelligence. One of these men, known to Yurchenko only by his codename Robert, proved to be former CIA officer Edward Lee Howard. After Howard realized that he was under investigation, he fled, defecting to the Soviet Union. The other traitor that Yurchenko discussed was the NSA agent that had volunteered his services at the Soviet embassy in Washington 5 years prior. Yurchenko could not remember the man's name, seeming to recall only that he went by the name of Mr. Long. Yurchenko did, however, remember a great many other details about the middle-aged, red-haired man who had so enthusiastically offered to sell American secrets that day. When, on the 20th of October 1985, Yurchenko was presented with a raft of color photographs of red-haired men that were either current or former NSA employees, he immediately pointed to the photo of Ronald Pelton. Until Yurchenko's debriefing, Pelton never faced so much as a whiff of suspicion of being a traitor. Fate had intervened to facilitate his downfall. As soon as there was a positive ID of their suspect, the FBI launched Operation Passerine, a large-scale investigation into Ronald Pelton involving as many as 200 FBI agents. The recording of Pelton's initial phone call to the Soviet embassy was played back to dozens of his former NSA colleagues, with at least one positive voice identification finally being made. Pelton was then traced to an apartment in Silver Springs, Maryland, but after days of surveillance, he never turned up. Further investigation led the FBI to Anne Barry's apartment, where Pelton was a regular guest. Once located, Pelton was placed under 24-hour FBI surveillance. His business phone was wiretapped, and listening devices were hidden in his car and his girlfriend's apartment. As the FBI listened, watched, and waited, their surveillance revealed nothing incriminating insofar as espionage was concerned. All they learned was that Ronald and his girlfriend Anne regularly took drugs together, and that Pelton was scheming to defraud a bank. While he could have been charged for this, bank fraud was not what the FBI wanted to nab him for. The surveillance was thus proving fruitless, and the pressure was on for the FBI to move on the man who they knew they couldn't prove as a spy in a court of law. Meanwhile, the FBI's star witness in its case against Ronald Pelton was growing agitated and discontent. The FBI ill-advisedly allowed Yurchenko to take a trip to Canada to meet his former mistress. She was by then a qualified pediatrician and married with 2 children. Yurchenko's hopes were dashed when she rejected his offer to elope and settle down with him in the USA. Adding insult to injury, a crestfallen Yurchenko was then appalled to learn that his defection and some of what had been discussed at his debriefing had been leaked by the CIA to the press. Yurchenko feared reprisals for his family back in Russia. He was also a complicated man and was not without his faults. When stationed in Washington for the KGB, he had bottled the handling of a potential informant, leading to the arrest of the CIA officer concerned before he was even able to sell his secrets to the Soviets. Yurchenko also had multiple affairs with the wives of his colleagues. Among these women was an American who is thought to have been an FBI informant. Yurchenko was also a hypochondriac, living in constant fear that he would get stomach cancer, a fate that had befallen his mother. The Vitaly Yurchenko story then took a dramatic twist on the 2nd of November 1985. Yurchenko was out for dinner with his CIA handler at a restaurant in the Georgetown area of Washington, D.C. This was just a stone's throw away from the Soviet embassy. At one point in the evening, Yurchenko stood up and reportedly said to his handler, "If I'm not back in 15 minutes, don't blame yourself." With those parting words, he left the restaurant, walked half a mile up Wisconsin Avenue and slipped in behind the gates of the Soviet compound. Just 3 months after defecting to the West, Yurchenko was going home to the Soviet Union. In the blink of an eye, the CIA's greatest intelligence coup of the Cold War turned into their worst nightmare. A few days later, Yurchenko appeared in a press conference in which he said that he had been drugged and kidnapped by the CIA. American authorities had no grounds to prevent Yurchenko from returning to the Soviet Union, and so could only look on with embarrassment as the Russian colonel boarded a flight headed for Moscow on the 6th of November 1985. Yurchenko's redefection was not only a major propaganda victory for the Soviet Union, it also presented a major setback in the FBI's investigation into Ronald Pelton. Without their star witness, the FBI had little evidence to fall back on in prosecuting charges of espionage against Pelton. It was decided that it was time to risk a direct approach, in the hopes that Pelton would confess. While this was a gamble, the FBI counted on Pelton's ego to make him talk. The FBI set themselves up in room 409 at the Annapolis Hilton Hotel, and agents David Faulkner and Dudley Hodgson rehearsed their roles for days. On the morning of the 24th of November 1985, Faulkner called Pelton at his place of work, asking to speak to him about a matter of national security. Letting either his ego or his curiosity get the better of him, Pelton agreed to meet, joining the 2 FBI agents at the Hilton Hotel later that day. Faulkner and Hodgson immediately got to work, regaling Pelton with a tale of a suspected mole, the details of which mirrored Pelton's own life and spying activities. The agents spoke of how the man had compromised Ivy Bells and had betrayed many other secrets of the NSA. They then played Pelton the recording of the man who phoned the Soviet embassy 5 years earlier. Although Pelton denied that he was the man they were after, when confronted by the sound of his own voice being played back on tape, Pelton started to crack. He changed tack, offering to cooperate with the FBI with a view to becoming a double agent. The FBI had no intention of even considering Pelton's offer, but nevertheless allowed him to prattle on about his visits to Vienna and the money he received from the Soviets. As lunchtime drew near, Pelton said that he needed to meet his girlfriend Anne for lunch. Reluctantly, the FBI allowed Pelton to leave, knowing that they didn't have quite enough evidence yet to make an arrest. Pelton was escorted from the hotel, but not before surrendering his passport. Pelton and Anne were watched as they went for lunch and then returned home to Anne's apartment. The FBI telephoned Pelton, urging him to return to the Hilton to answer further questions. Thinking perhaps that his offer of becoming a double agent was still on the cards, Pelton agreed. Once back in the hot seat in the hotel room, it wasn't long before Pelton admitted to handing over secret information to a foreign power, and that he had done so knowing that his actions had harmed American national security and put lives at risk. This was precisely the evidence the FBI needed, and Pelton was promptly arrested. The FBI had made the right call. Thinking that he was always the smartest man in the room, Pelton's ego had got the better of him, with the result that he now faced the prospects of a lengthy prison sentence. Had he remained silent, Pelton might have avoided his arrest. With the FBI's star witness behind the Iron Curtain, their evidence against Pelton was circumstantial at best. The American public was still reeling from half a dozen other American spies rounded up that year, including John Walker and Jonathan Pollard, when the news of Ronald Pelton's arrest was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The revelation of moles within the CIA and the Navy was shocking enough, but nobody ever thought that the most secretive of American intelligence agencies, the one which was jokingly referred to as no such agency, could be the one to be compromised. Despite his confession, Pelton chose to plead not guilty, and the matter went to trial. Although there was little in the way of hard evidence to go on beyond the confession and the taped telephone conversation, on the 5th of June 1986, a jury of his peers found Ronald Pelton guilty on 4 of the 5 charges against him, with a 6th charge being dismissed. Pelton was sentenced to serve 3 concurrent life sentences. The judge in the case remarked that Pelton's treachery had caused inestimable damage to US signals intelligence. All this for payment of $35,000, a sum that was not even enough to settle Pelton's debts. Shortly after his conviction, Pelton was debriefed by the FBI in an effort to discover the extent of the harm that he had caused. While he spoke at length about the sort of information he gave to the Soviets, the FBI always had the sense that Pelton was holding back on them. To test this theory, in 1987, the FBI sent a woman posing as a lawyer acting for a local newspaper to speak to Pelton. Thinking everything he said was subject to attorney-client privilege, Pelton finally opened the floodgates, revealing a myriad other NSA secrets that he had sold. The statement that the fictitious lawyer walked away with that day is said to have contained information so sensitive that it was decided not to bring further charges against Pelton for fear of the details being aired in court. After a failed appeal, Pelton served his mandatory 30 years behind bars at the Anne Arundel County Detention Center. Just before Thanksgiving in 2015, he was paroled. Then aged 74 and penniless, Pelton returned to a world that had forgotten him. He lived with his daughter in Maryland until his death on the 6th of September 2022. In comparison to his peers, the name Ronald Pelton remains obscure, just a vestige of 1985's Year of the Spy. When he was caught, Pelton had already left the spying game. There were other American spies, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen in particular, who are believed to have caused far more harm than Pelton. There are many unanswered questions around his compromise by Vitaly Yurchenko. Some counterintelligence officials believe that Yurchenko was in fact a triple agent, sent to betray Edward Lee Howard and Ronald Pelton in order to protect Aldrich Ames, the KGB's more valuable American asset. Pelton, like Howard, may have been just a throwaway spy, a convenient way for the KGB to shift the blame to a man who was no longer of any value. Scapegoat or not, Ronald Pelton sold out his country, and for that, will always be remembered as a traitor. In the sun-drenched streets of the Vatican in the summer of 1985, a high-ranking KGB officer slipped away from his group touring the Vatican Museum. He disappeared without trace, only to re-emerge a few weeks later in the United States. Vitaly Yurchenko's defection was an intelligence coup for the CIA. In a secure safe house in Northern Virginia, Yurchenko faced his American interrogators. The air was thick with tension as he began to divulge KGB secrets. The CIA's glee turned to dismay as Yurchenko began to speak of a mole within their ranks. He didn't know his name, only his code name. Agent Robert had been preparing for a posting to the CIA's Moscow station before abruptly being taken off the assignment. The CIA agent's blood ran cold. Agent Robert could be only one man, a disgruntled former CIA employee who had been fired from the agency 2 years prior. Ever since, the CIA had done their best to conceal the affair from the FBI. The man's name was Edward Lee Howard. When, on the 20th of October 1983, Ed Howard stood outside the front entrance to the Soviet embassy in Washington contemplating betrayal, one wonders whether he considered his life up to that point. Before his fall from grace just a few short months prior, Edward, or Eddie as his parents called him, was set to live the American dream. He was born on the 27th of October 1951 in Alamogordo, New Mexico. His father was a career Air Force sergeant who worked as a missile guidance technician. Edward's mother, Mary Jaramillo, was a waitress from Albuquerque. The nature of his father's job meant that young Edward was never able to put down firm roots. In his youth, he moved from airbase to airbase, living in half a dozen US states and 3 other countries. The family was Catholic and couldn't have been more proud when Eddie became an altar boy while living in West Germany in 1962. He continued his religious service when his family moved back to the USA in 1965 to Wichita Falls, Texas. Just 4 years later, the family was uprooted yet again, this time moving to England in 1969, where Edward attended boarding school. By the fall of that year, Edward was back in the States to attend college at the University of Texas. Aged 18, Edward managed to avoid the draft to fight in the Vietnam War and spent a semester studying in Munich. In 1971, Edward returned to complete his studies in Texas, graduating in the top 10% of his class with a bachelor's degree in international business and economics. It was, however, Edward's dream to join the CIA, but he was turned down by a recruiter due to his young age. He instead joined the Peace Corps, being motivated by his sense of adventure and knowledge that the Peace Corps was a proving ground for future CIA recruits. After a brief stint in Costa Rica and the Dominican Republic, he was sent in February 1973 to work in Bucaramanga, Colombia. It was here that he met Mary Cedarleaf. While Edward was Catholic and came from a middle-class background, Mary, with her curly brown hair and blue eyes, was Lutheran, and from a comfortable upper-middle-class family. Edward's attraction to Mary was immediate, and it wasn't long before the pair started dating. But Mary wasn't the only thing attracting Edward's attention at that stage of his life. As it remains to this day, Colombia was then a major producer of cocaine. Howard dabbled in recreational drug use, from marijuana to cocaine. In January of 1975, Howard returned to Washington, where he enrolled at the American University. Although he and Mary had parted ways some time earlier, their paths reconverged when Mary returned stateside. A few months after Howard earned his master's degree in business administration, the couple were married in Minnesota in 1976. Soon after their nuptials, and still intent on working for the CIA, Edward joined the Agency for International Development and was assigned to work in Lima, Peru, where he moved with his young wife Mary. Again, drugs were plentiful and Edward indulged himself. By 1979, Edward chose to leave aid, returning to Chicago, where he put his business acumen to use by working for various consulting firms. Then aged 28, Edward was flying high. He was well educated, was married and had his own home, had a raft of international experience under his belt, and was on his way to becoming a successful business executive. Behind closed doors, however, cracks were starting to show. Edward had continued with his drug use after returning to America and was abusing alcohol, although he did so discreetly. This caused much friction in his marriage, with Edward and Mary frequently arguing over his need to clean himself up. Despite these first signs of personal strife, Howard still pursued his lifelong goal of working for the CIA. After applying to the agency, he passed his first screening interview in 1980. He thereafter underwent a thorough evaluation process, which included background checks, psychological assessments, and multiple further interviews. This included a polygraph test during which Edward admitted to his drug use. According to the CIA's recruitment policies, this was not an automatic disqualification, provided the applicant promised not to continue using those drugs. He no doubt made the requisite undertakings, and in January of 1981, Howard realized his life's ambition by being recruited as a bona fide CIA agent. He moved to Langley, Virginia, while his wife Mary remained behind in the family home in Barrington, Illinois. He was trained for 4 months at Camp Peary, known as the Farm, in tradecraft, and qualified to join the elite Soviet East European Division, a CIA unit concerned with clandestine services and, in the context of the 1980s Cold War, the place to be for any aspiring career intelligence officer. Edward, however, continued to battle his personal demons, being noticed by his colleagues for drinking far too heavily. The issue was so prevalent that when Edward was assigned first to the East German desk after completing his training at the Farm, he visited the CIA's alcoholism counselor, who suggested to Edward that he just needed a little time to settle into his newly changed life. In 1981, Edward's wife Mary also joined the CIA, which seemed the next logical move for her when moving to join her husband in Virginia. Like her husband, Mary was assigned to the Directorate of Operations, where she worked as a secretary at the CIA's language school. Less than 2 years into his intelligence career, Ed Howard was proving himself among his colleagues and superiors, and was being groomed for the biggest assignment of his life. The CIA planned to send Howard to the US Embassy in Moscow. Deep behind the Iron Curtain and in the heart of the so-called evil empire, Edward Howard was to work under diplomatic cover while secretly running Russian spies and informants for the CIA. In preparation for his deep cover assignment, Howard spent the next 15 months working the Soviet desk at agency headquarters. It was here that he gained experience in Soviet counterintelligence methods and operations. He analyzed intelligence reports, read embassy cable traffic, assisted in planning classified operations and running undercover CIA operatives. Crucially, Howard had access to the code names and contact procedures for all the CIA's assets in the Soviet capital. He also knew where the CIA was running wiretaps and where listening bugs had been planted. His cover identity was carefully crafted, with Howard undergoing all the formal training required to be officially appointed, through documents signed by the US President no less, to a consular position in the US Foreign Service. In March 1983, Edward and Mary welcomed their first child into the world, a son whom they named Lee. The following month, and with Edward on the cusp of his departure to Moscow planned for late June that year, Edward was told that he had to take another polygraph test. Although surprised as he was not due for a routine test, he was told it was nothing to worry about. It was a mere formality, given the sensitive location of his posting. Little did Edward Lee Howard know that he was headed for a career-ending disaster. A polygraph test is designed to measure 4 changes in a person's physiological responses to questioning: breathing, blood pressure, heart rate, and perspiration. The physical stress of knowingly telling a lie is said to cause physiological changes which can be measured by the polygraph, and to indicate whether a person is likely to be deceiving the examiner. The efficacy of such tests have long been disputed, with the general consensus today being that the polygraph, which can easily be beaten by taking tranquilizers or through mental conditioning, can detect only excitement, not lies. Nevertheless, in the 1980s, the CIA placed immeasurable faith in the polygraph, perhaps believing that its effectiveness depended on the test subject believing that it was, in fact, effective. Edward Lee Howard took his polygraph test in April of 1983. He was questioned about his historical and current drug use since having been employed by the CIA, which he denied, and matters of petty theft. Edward admitted to stealing $40 from a woman's cosmetic bag that was left unattended next to him on an aeroplane. These issues, he thought, were no big deal, but to his dismay, he was called back again and again and again to answer further questions. Before his fourth and final polygraph test, Howard took a tranquilizer and he was put through the ringer, being accused of attempting to hide from the CIA that he had committed a major crime. However, when all was said and done, Howard was told that everything had checked out. Thinking that he was in the clear, Howard returned home to his wife and in-laws, bottle of champagne in hand, to celebrate the family's impending departure to Moscow. Yet not everything was all well and good. The CIA were having second thoughts about sending a man who they were concerned was psychologically unfit for the stress of the job. The admission of theft and the drug use were not the deal breakers. It was the indication of deception that the CIA decided could not be tolerated. Something had to be done, and quickly. It was then decided, to the mutual shock of Edward Lee Howard and his CIA colleagues, to terminate the Moscow assignment and to compel Howard to resign from the agency. Aghast, Howard was quickly escorted from CIA headquarters without even having a chance to clear his desk. Life for Howard would never be the same again. Reeling from the sudden implosion of his career, Howard moved his family back to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he got a job as an economic analyst. The bitter resentment he felt for his abrupt dismissal sent him into a downward spiral of alcohol abuse. He started making crank calls to the US Embassy in Moscow and even confronted his former agency boss, Tom Mills, in his driveway at home one night. The CIA, although having averted sending an unstable alcoholic on one of its most sensitive assignments, now had a potentially even bigger problem on their hands. A disgruntled employee holding intimate knowledge of its most top-secret Soviet operations and agents. The potential security threat fell within the purview of the FBI to investigate and mitigate. However, as is so often the case with interagency rivalry, the CIA chose to cover up the situation. The FBI was kept in total darkness, blissfully unaware of the security risk that was soon to explode. For the CIA, the Howard affair was to be contained at all costs, in the hopes that nothing would come of it. The agency's worst fears would, unfortunately, soon come to be realized. Edward Lee Howard's anger and indignation continued to fester. Eventually, he could no longer contain it. On the 20th of October 1983, Howard returned to Washington on business for the first time since leaving the CIA. He headed straight for the Soviet embassy, where he hung around outside contemplating walking in to offer his services to the Soviets. Although he later said that he did not do so, the truth of the matter remains somewhat opaque. What can be ascertained is that sometime in 1983, Howard made first contact with the Soviets by delivering a letter to the embassy in which he identified himself as a disgruntled former employee of the CIA. In February of 1984, Howard got himself into some trouble with the law. He was charged with aggravated assault after a late-night drunken brawl between him and a car full of younger men ended with Howard firing off a round of his .44 Magnum. In exchange, Howard was disarmed by the men and beaten to a pulp. The facts of the incident and who started it are disputed, but the result for Howard following a plea bargain was that he received a 5-year probationary sentence. Clearly acting out his frustrations, Howard could not let go of what happened to him in the CIA. The following month, in March of 1984, he propositioned a former colleague and friend working in the US Foreign Service to approach the Soviet embassy in Mexico City to sell US secrets. This friend was William George Bosch, a fellow intelligence officer and former colleague. The offer was turned down, but by this stage, Howard, at least in his own mind, had crossed the Rubicon. He wanted to do a job on the CIA, and there was no turning back. He cashed in his Crown life insurance policy and announced to his family that they would be taking a trip to Europe. In September of 1984, the Howard family spent 8 days touring Western Europe. Howard's probation conditions did not allow him to leave New Mexico unless for business, and so he invented a phantom economics conference that he said he was attending in Munich. In reality, Edward made his way to Vienna, the Cold War espionage capital of the world. How contact between Howard and the KGB was formalized is not known, but it could well have been that the Soviets responded to Howard's letter of the previous year. In Vienna, behind the Soviet embassy gates, Howard was able to meet with the KGB beyond prying eyes. The CIA were keeping general tabs on Howard's movements and were growing concerned about his absence. On the 25th of September 1984, the day after his return from Europe, 2 agents were sent to check in on Howard to assess his frame of mind. Remarkably, during a breakfast meeting in Santa Fe, Howard confessed to the CIA agents that he had contemplated selling secrets to the Soviets, although he said he never acted on the impulse. The CIA then knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were sitting on a ticking time bomb. The agency faced a conundrum. If they brought the matter to the attention of the FBI, the cover-up would be made known. They chose to remain silent, paying for Ed Howard to see a psychiatrist in the hope that he stayed on an even keel. Their hope was in vain, for Edward took a second family holiday to Europe in April of 1985. The trip, again in breach of his probation, was ostensibly to sell some Peruvian antiques. The real reason for his return to Vienna was, of course, to meet again with the KGB for a further debriefing in exchange for cash and a Rolex watch. Howard started buying Kruger Rands with his ill-gotten gains, amassing for himself what he planned to be his retirement and which he buried near his home in the New Mexico desert. While Edward Lee Howard enjoyed his new KGB riches and the CIA buried their heads in the sand, circumstances beyond the control of both would soon thrust their hidden truths into the harsh light of international scrutiny. On the 14th of June 1985, the Soviet news agency TASS announced that Paul Skip Stormbow had been arrested on the 9th of June while in the act of committing espionage. It said that he had been declared persona non grata and expelled from the Soviet Union. The press release made no mention of the arrest of the Russian man also alleged to be involved. It was only 3 months later that Moscow announced the man's name. He was a defense researcher and a leading expert on stealth aircraft technology working for the Scientific Research Institute of Radar. His name was Adolf G. Tolkachev. He just so happened to be the CIA's most valuable agent in place behind the Iron Curtain. Tolkachev was later tried and executed for his treason. The loss to American intelligence was enormous. Tolkachev was an asset formerly run by none other than Edward Lee Howard. The coincidence was impossible for the CIA to ignore. Then, in the summer of 1985, Vitaly Yurchenko, the high-ranking KGB officer who disappeared from his tour group in Rome, defected to the USA. Once Yurchenko was safely ensconced within a safe house in Northern Virginia, a rigorous joint debriefing was undertaken by the CIA and FBI. The interviews would stretch over the next 3 months. Among the secrets divulged by Yurchenko was the presence of 2 moles within the ranks of American intelligence. The first man he fingered turned out to be NSA intelligence analyst Ronald Pelton. The second man, known to Yurchenko only by his codename Robert, would lead investigators to the foot of Edward Lee Howard's door. Yurchenko's own story took a dramatic twist when, on the evening of the 2nd of November 1985, he left his CIA companion behind at a quaint Georgetown restaurant and slipped in behind the welcoming gates of the Soviet embassy. Yurchenko claimed that he had been kidnapped and drugged by the Americans. His redefection was a propaganda victory for the Soviets, who painted the CIA as unscrupulous villains. The CIA's efforts to conceal the problem of Ed Howard was over. The FBI agents in the room with Yurchenko had heard the details from the proverbial horse's mouth. The CIA had no option then but to allow the FBI to do what it should have done a year prior: launch a massive investigation into the life of Edward Lee Howard. When the FBI was finally brought into the picture, Ed Howard was in fact paying his spy masters an emergency visit in Vienna. Given Yurchenko's defection, the KGB more than likely wanted to warn Howard of the possibility that he had been compromised. Back in the United States, and in the absence of their star witness Yurchenko, the FBI hoped to either catch Howard in the act of espionage or extract a confession. In the words of author David Wise, espionage is an invisible crime. Unless the criminal is caught in the act of meeting with agents of a foreign power or chooses to confess, espionage is extremely difficult to prove. Being well aware of this, the FBI moved the G's, its special surveillance team, into Howard's neighborhood in Santa Fe. The flat terrain and widely spaced houses in El Dorado made watching Howard a difficult task. Another problem was that Howard used to be one of them. He was well trained in surveillance and counter-surveillance, and by that stage was undoubtedly suspicious that the authorities were onto him. It wasn't long before he realized he was being watched. By the beginning of September of 1985, a wiretap had also been covertly installed in Howard's home. This allowed agents to listen in not only on telephone calls, but every conversation going on inside the house. But, being a well-trained intelligence officer, Ed Howard let nothing slip, and the FBI agents listened for days in vain from their mobile van posted down the street. As the days dragged on with little signs of Ed Howard incriminating himself, the threat of him doing a runner grew ever greater. The FBI decided it was time to close in on their target and confront him directly. Surprisingly, Howard agreed to meet with FBI investigators in a room at the Santa Fe Hilton Hotel on the 19th of September 1985. The investigators got down to brass tacks just as soon as Howard had sat down. Despite the screws being turned, Howard denied the accusations of spying and espionage leveled against him. There was no point in concealing their surveillance any longer, so investigators switched to a less subtle approach. From then on, Howard found himself quite obviously watched at every moment, and he knew he had to make a dash for it before he was arrested. By Saturday, the 21st of September 1985, Howard had made up his mind to flee the country. Even if charges of espionage didn't stick, Howard's 3 probation violations would have been enough to put him behind bars for up to 9 years. Being an expert in counter-surveillance techniques, Howard crafted for himself a jack-in-the-box, or jib. This was a spring-loaded device used by the CIA during the Cold War to help agents escape surveillance. Usually concealed in a briefcase or other innocuous object, the jack-in-the-box consisted of a pop-up dummy that resembled the head and torso of a person. During his training, Howard learned to jump from the passenger side of a slowly moving vehicle. As he exited the car, the jib would be deployed, leaving a dummy sitting in the seat while Howard made his getaway. As it turned out, the jib was not even needed. As Mary Howard pulled out of their driveway with Edward beside her that Saturday afternoon, a hapless fresh recruit sitting in an FBI surveillance van squinted against the harshness of the afternoon desert sun. Whether he was distracted or simply wasn't able to see clearly, the agent was completely unaware that Mary and Howard left their home at 4:30 that afternoon. After deploying the jack-in-the-box and jumping from his car as his wife drove on, Howard moved quickly, traveling first from Santa Fe to Albuquerque to Tucson and then on to New York. Meanwhile, and blissfully unaware that their prime suspect had just become a fugitive, FBI investigators had been interrogating William George Bosch for the previous 4 days, the friend whom Howard had propositioned to sell secrets to the Soviets in Mexico City. The FBI had managed to track Bosch down to South Padre Island off the southern coast of Texas. Bosch had himself left the intelligence community under a cloud, and as FBI agents slowly wore him down, he began to reveal details of Howard's plan to betray his country. That Saturday night, by which time Howard had ironically already made his escape, the FBI determined that it had probable cause to seek a warrant of arrest against Howard for conspiracy to commit espionage. The arrest warrant was only granted on Monday, the 23rd of September 1985. It was, however, too little too late. By the time the FBI realized that their suspect had eluded them, Howard had had a 24-hour head start. After arriving at JFK Airport the day prior, Howard flew to Copenhagen and then to Frankfurt. For the next 9 months, Howard remained on the move, apparently working various jobs in Europe and then traveling to Canada and South America. He phoned his wife Mary in March of 1986, and in June sent her a postcard which revealed that he was in Vienna. At some point in his travels, Ed Howard made it to Helsinki. There he presented himself at the Soviet embassy, where he offered information in exchange for protection. On the 7th of August 1986, Ed Howard, international fugitive and the FBI's most wanted man, re-emerged in Moscow. Understandably, the FBI and the CIA in particular were sharply criticized for their mishandling of the Howard case. The blatant cover-up aside, the whole situation could have been avoided if Howard was transitioned into a less risky role instead of being unceremoniously dumped. During a secret CIA inquiry, even the agency head, William Casey, admitted that they screwed up. The damage caused by Howard to American intelligence was considered immense. At least one Soviet CIA asset, Tolkachev, the so-called billion-dollar spy, was executed as a result of Howard's actions. The information he sold to the Soviets, at least according to one intelligence official, wiped out the Moscow station. Soon after Howard's reappearance in Moscow, there was a spate of expulsions of American diplomats by the Soviet Union. Earning for himself the dishonorable title of being the first CIA agent to defect to the Soviet Union, Edward Howard faced an uncertain and bleak future. He joined the ranks of other Western defectors like Kim Philby and George Blake, who experienced the reality of living in a new, strange land where true friends were few and far between. While Howard was awarded an apartment in Moscow by the KGB and even a country dacha, he lived in constant fear of being abducted by the Americans and was provided round-the-clock protection by the KGB. Howard's most obvious motivation to betray his country appears to be the resentment he felt for his dismissal from the CIA. Politically, he was conservative and was never known to show any signs of sympathy for the Soviet cause or its ideology. While reports conflict about the extent to which he was paid for selling American secrets, the CIA was able to link Howard to a Swiss bank account into which $150,000 had been deposited. This was apart from the case of Krugerrands and money supposedly buried in the desert near to his New Mexico home. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Howard's star began to wane. He had been paid a salary by the KGB for 5 years following his defection, during which time he set up his own consulting business. Edward's wife Mary and their son Lee visited him in Moscow from time to time, but remained living in the USA. Howard steadfastly maintained his innocence. He appeared on Soviet television, during which he proclaimed his love for his country and denied any wrongdoing. He said that he only approached the KGB after fleeing the USA, when he believed his guilt had already been assumed by US authorities. Howard also claimed that he had been set up by the KGB to deflect attention from a true mole operating within the CIA. That mole turned out to be none other than Aldrich Ames. There are certainly many questions that remain unanswered in the Edward Lee Howard affair, even 4 decades after the events transpired. Yurchenko's defection and then decision 3 months later to return to the Soviet Union, where he was welcomed back as a hero, is a saga in its own right. It emerged that it was Eldridge Ames himself who had been in charge of Yurchenko's debriefing. Did Ames control the narrative in that process? Did he deflect attention away from himself by having Yurchenko point the finger at Howard? The answers to these questions we will perhaps never know. Edward Lee Howard lived in Moscow until his death in 2002. The dubious official cause for his sudden demise was a broken neck that he suffered after a fall down the stairs at his dacha outside Moscow. Whether he fell accidentally or was pushed remains an open question.
The country on the West African coast called Ghana is hardly the place one expects a true Cold War espionage drama to play out. It had no Berlin Wall, no missile sites. In truth, it was just a nation of gold mines and cocoa plantations trying to find its way after independence in 1957. But it was in its capital city, Accra, that Ghana became a Cold War battleground in the proxy war between the United States and Soviet Union as they competed for the soul of an entire continent. This silent war raged for years, with neither side giving an inch. But then, disaster. It was a textbook honey trap operation that obliterated America's intelligence network across West Africa. Ghanaian intelligence services engineered a sophisticated romance targeting the most vulnerable point in any spy operation: the human heart. All it took was one charming operative targeting a lonely American woman on assignment for the CIA. 18 months of seduction and manipulation ended in the complete destruction of the CIA's presence in Ghana. This is the story of Sharon Scranage, which was yet another devastating blow for American intelligence in the infamous Year of the Spy that was 1985. Sharon Marie Scranage was born in October 1955 in King George County, Virginia. Her life was equal parts church and farming. Sharon grew up where everyone knew everyone. Her father Perry worked at the U.S. Naval Service Weapons Center in Dahlgren, then at the Marine Base in Quantico. This was solid government work with a steady paycheck. The Scranage family owned 19 parcels of land scattered across King George County. Their roots were planted deep in American soil, stretching back over a century. Every Sunday, Sharon's voice rose with the Little Ark Baptist Church choir. Her friends would later say that choir and the church were practically her entire life. At King George High School, she cheered at football games and joined the Student Cooperative Association. After graduating in 1974, she headed to the National Business College in Roanoke. 2 years of secretarial studies and a brief 15-month marriage to a security guard later, Sharon was looking for a new start and for something bigger than King George County could offer. That's when the Central Intelligence Agency came calling. The CIA recruited Sharon as a clerk stenographer in its Office of Imagery Analysis. As a department within the Directorate of Intelligence, the function of the OIA was to analyze imagery collected by reconnaissance platforms. This was primarily satellite systems, and before that, photographs captured by the U-2 and SR-71 aircraft. For 7 years, she processed documents, typed reports, and filed classified materials. The reports she typed were circulated throughout the US intelligence community, supporting everything from arms control verification to crisis monitoring. For Sharon, the work was routine, but it came with a security clearance and access to America's deepest secrets. Her supervisor saw a reliable, church-going woman from a good family, someone who would never cause any trouble. They were catastrophically wrong. In December 1983, Sharon Scranage arrived in the humid West African city of Accra, the capital of Ghana. At 28, she had finally escaped small-town Virginia for an assignment that sounded exotic: Operations Support Assistant at the US Embassy in Ghana. While her role remained clerical, she was then working under diplomatic cover within the CIA's Directorate of Operations, the clandestine side of the agency. She typed up and handled documents that identified CIA informants inside Ghana, as well as all manner of reports and memoranda. CIA embassy outposts in the former colonial territories were far smaller than their First World counterparts, making operational compartmentalization more difficult. Sharon was the sole support assistant in the Accra station, which meant that she had unusually deep access to operational files. Although she was not a trained operations officer, she had almost the same level of access. And what Sharon didn't fully grasp was that she had landed in the middle of a Cold War battlefield. 2 years earlier, in 1981, Flight Lieutenant Jerry Rawlings had seized power in Ghana's second military coup. His Provisional National Defense Council was flirting with socialist policies, establishing worker councils, and turning to Moscow for support. Ghana's strategic location, vast gold reserves, and cocoa plantations made it a prize both superpowers desperately wanted to control. The Americans were growing increasingly more anxious. Here was another African nation potentially falling into the Soviet orbit, just as Angola and Mozambique had done. The CIA maintained an extensive spy network inside Ghana's government and military, having at least 8 high-ranking officials secretly feeding intelligence to Langley. Captain Kojo Sikata, Ghana's intelligence chief, knew exactly what the Americans were up to. Educated at Britain's Sandhurst Military Academy and battle-tested in liberation wars across Africa, Sikata was no amateur. He had served with guerrilla movements in Congo, Mozambique, and Angola. This was a man who understood exactly how the Cold War game was played, and he was about to play it masterfully. Michael Sissoudis cut a striking figure in Accra's diplomatic circles. Born in April 1946, he was the son of a French-Ghanaian mother and a Greek father. At 37 years old, he was handsome and fluent in English with an American accent that turned heads. He had been raised in West Germany, educated in New York City, and had married and divorced an American woman. He held permanent US residency, but he remained African and Ghanaian at heart. What the embassy's social circuit didn't know was that Sissoudis was Captain Sikata's secret spy weapon. Sissoudis was related to Jerry Rawlings himself. Apparently the two men were cousins. His Western education wasn't accidental. It was preparation for his future career in espionage. His playboy lifestyle was equal measures of indulgence and operational cover. His natural charm was his weapon, turning him into a veritable African James Bond. On the other hand, Sharon Scranage, while excited for her new opportunity, had arrived in Ghana an emotional wreck. She quickly became homesick and lonely. Feeling isolated, her colleagues noted that she often broke down into tears at work. She had left behind her social and emotional support structures in the US and was vulnerable. Ghanaian intelligence, the Bureau of National Investigations, or BNI, was always alert to new arrivals at the US Embassy and assessed American staff for possible weaknesses. In Sharon, they quickly recognized that she met the perfect criteria for recruitment. She had broad access to classified materials, and they knew that she was lonely, inexperienced, and most likely susceptible to flattery and affection. Intelligence services call it a honey trap. Seduce the target, build emotional dependency, then extract classified information. It's one of the oldest tricks in the espionage playbook, and Sissoudis was a master practitioner. Just a few days after her arrival in Accra in 1983, Sharon Scranage was introduced to Michael Sissoudis at a diplomatic reception. The Baptist girl from rural Virginia was swept off her feet by the sophisticated man of the world. He was everything King George County never offered: classy, educated, and exciting. When he paid attention to her, he really paid attention, and she felt something she had never experienced. While Sharon was falling in love, Michael was going to work. The affair began innocently enough. Dinner dates, long walks along Accra's beaches, and that sort of thing. For Sharon, it was the romance she had dreamed about since high school. For Sisudis, it was his first steps in a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation. By November 1983, the relationship was getting serious, at least in Sharon's mind. She became increasingly withdrawn from her CIA station colleagues as she spent more and more time with her new boyfriend, Michael. One evening during a dinner party hosted by Sharon at her home, a U.S. Office of Security officer spotted a major red flag. Positioned prominently on Sharon's vanity mirror was a photograph of a man whom the officer recognized instantly. The photo was also intimate, picturing Sisudis shirtless in bed, looking directly at the camera. As Sharon fell more deeply in love, her discretion fell by the wayside. She started to meet openly with Michael in public, knowing full well that he was in some way connected to Ghanaian intelligence. Her meetings, naturally, had not gone unnoticed. That same month, in November 1983, Ghanaian officials complained to the US Embassy that someone matching Sharon's description had been holding secret meetings with Ghanaian citizens. Sharon was immediately called in for a discussion, but instead of being ordered to end the relationship and going against all protocols, the CIA station chief in Accra instead only advised Sharon to be careful and that she should consider gradually breaking off the relationship. Sharon, of course, ignored the warnings completely. The relationship only deepened, with Sharon becoming increasingly emotionally attached and dependent on the affection given to her by Michael. As the months continued, Sisudis tightened his control, beginning to exert more pressure on Sharon to provide him information about her job. Perhaps Sharon was reluctant at first, we just don't know, but ultimately she was convinced that telling Michael all that she knew about CIA operations as it came across her desk was not an act of betrayal, but rather proof of her love and trust. Over the next 18 months, Sharon provided Sisudis with classified material ranging from the list of names and identities of all the CIA informants in Ghana that she knew of, and details about CIA operational plans and future activities. She also shared information about CIA communications equipment and technical capabilities. Most crucial of all for Ghana's leader, Sharon passed on information about a dissident group's planned coup against Rawlings' government. Captain Sikata understood the goldmine of information he had been handed by Michael Sisudis. What he received didn't stay in Accra. It was passed on to Havana, Tripoli, East Berlin, and to the Soviet Union itself. From Cuba's intelligence service to Libya's revolutionary government, East Germany's Stasi and the KGB, America's Cold War enemies then had a detailed blueprint of CIA operations throughout West Africa. The compromise spread like cancer through US intelligence networks. Communication channels were blown. Safe houses were exposed. Recruitment methods were revealed. Years of careful intelligence work had evaporated, almost overnight. The CIA just didn't know it yet. The 8 men exposed by Scranage held positions ranging from the CEO of Ghana's National Procurement Agency to a senior-ranking officer in Ghana's military, the former chief superintendent of police, and beyond. Ghana's BNI didn't move immediately on the 8 men. They chose instead to bide their time and to see what other valuable information Michael could extract from Sharon. Sharon, lost in her romantic haze, had no idea of the devastation she was causing. She believed she had found true love with a man who understood her in ways no one from King George County ever could. That could not have been further from the truth. In May of 1985, Sharon's assignment in Ghana came to an end. She returned to CIA headquarters in Langley for routine reassignment processing. Standard procedure called for a polygraph examination. This was usually a formality, but in Sharon Scranage's case, it proved her downfall. Say what you will about the polygraph, but the moment she was hooked up to the sensors, Sharon's world imploded. She wasn't a trained intelligence officer and had no idea how to beat the machine. She was stressed when she took the test, and her physiological response clearly showed it. The CIA polygraph operator quickly determined that she was being deceptive in her responses. This triggered an internal review during which Sharon Scranage admitted to the CIA that she had been handing over classified information to a Ghanaian gentleman. After this admission, the FBI took over. For days, she was interrogated in sterile government offices. Sharon, raised to respect authority and tell the truth, broke down completely, confessing in detail all that she had done. The FBI agents listening to her confession realized they were dealing with yet another catastrophe in American intelligence. But Sharon's cooperation had given them an opportunity. She had agreed to help set a trap for her lover. On the 10th of July 1985, Sharon Scranage sat nervously in a room at the Springfield Holiday Inn. FBI agents were positioned throughout the building, watching, waiting. Michael was traveling in the United States at the time, and Sharon, under the direction of the CIA, had lured Michael to the hotel under the pretense of a personal rendezvous, and so that she could share important information with him about her new position at CIA headquarters. When Sesudis entered the room, he was expecting, among other things, to collect more American secrets. Instead, federal agents swooped in and made their arrest without incident. The next day, on the 11th of July 1985, Sharon was also formally arrested and charged with 18 counts, including espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and breaching the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. Michael, on the other hand, was indicted on 8 counts of espionage for soliciting and possessing classified information on CIA assets and operations. Sharon's case was quite different to all the other spying scandals that plagued American intelligence that year. Her spying had not been about money or ideology. This had been about a lonely woman who was out of her depth and had fallen in love with the wrong man. Meanwhile, back in Ghana, news quickly broke about Michael's arrest, and an international diplomatic incident was about to boil over. The BNI moved quickly, rounding up all 8 of the compromised CIA informants by the end of July that year. In October 1985, Sharon pleaded guilty to 3 charges, 1 count of espionage and 2 counts of disclosing CIA personnel identities. Judge Richard Williams sentenced her to 5 years in federal prison. But the judge had also made an unusual recommendation for sentence reduction, noting the disparity between Sharon's involvement in the conspiracy as compared to that of its mastermind, Michael. Sharon also agreed as part of the plea deal to testify against Michael. Sesudis, on the other hand, pleaded no contest to espionage charges during closed proceedings. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Behind the scenes, diplomatic wheels had already been spinning. The 8 Ghanaian CIA informants arrested in Ghana as a result of the breach were facing sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment. The US State Department knew that these men would most likely die in Ghanaian prisons unless something dramatic was done. The deal that was struck was a classic of Cold War espionage, a good old spy swap. The United States was prepared to hand over Sesudis in exchange for the 8 Ghanaian CIA informants. Eventually, Ghana agreed. The informants were stripped of their Ghanaian citizenship and handed over to US officials. Sesudis' sentence was promptly reduced to time served, with the condition that he had to leave the United States immediately, which, of course, he did. On the 3rd of December 1985, Michael Sesudis stepped off an aircraft in Accra to a hero's welcome. Thousands of Ghanaians cheered for the man who had outsmarted the CIA. He was heralded as a successful spy and became a symbol of African success, a case of David versus Goliath, where Ghanaian intelligence triumphed over Western interference. Sesudis later entered politics, co-founding the Eagle Party within Rawlings's National Democratic Congress in 1992. His seduction of an American CIA employee was celebrated as a masterstroke of intelligence warfare. For Captain Kojo Tsikata, the operation had been an unqualified success. He had penetrated the CIA's West African network completely, demonstrating that African intelligence services could outmaneuver their Western counterparts. The intelligence gathered through Sharon had flowed to Ghana's allies across 3 continents. Jerry Rawlings's government had been strengthened by knowing exactly who had been working against them. The planned coup was thwarted before it even began. Ghana had been a target of American intelligence operations since its independence in 1957. Later declassified documents confirmed direct CIA involvement in the 1966 coup that had overthrown President Kwame Nkrumah. This history had made Ghana's intelligence services particularly vigilant about Western espionage activities. This was in part a reason for its alignment with the Soviet Union. By the mid to late 1980s, Ghana's collapsing economy forced a pivot. Rawlings abandoned his socialist experiments and embraced IMF and World Bank-led structural adjustment programs. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 accelerated Ghana's realignment with the West. In 1992, Ghana adopted a new constitution and shifted from military rule to multi-party democracy, with Rawlings recasting himself as an elected civilian president. Today's reality is a far cry from the Cold War fears of permanent Soviet and communist influence. This outcome notwithstanding, the damage to US intelligence capabilities in West Africa lasted for years. Beyond the immediate loss of 8 high-level informants, the compromise had revealed operational methods, communication systems, and recruitment techniques that needed complete overhauling. As for the 8 CIA informants, they and their families were quietly relocated to the USA. For obvious reasons, the details of where they ended up and what they may be up to today has been kept secret. In April 1986, Sharon's sentence was reduced to 2 years. She ultimately served only 8 months at the federal women's prison in Alderson, West Virginia. The judge in the case said that the court doesn't believe either the citizens of the United States or Ms. Scranage are going to profit from her remaining warehoused. From what can be gleaned online, Michael Sasudis passed away on the 4th of September 2024. The case of Sharon Scranage is unique among her contemporary spies because she was neither a greedy mercenary nor an ideological true believer. Without defending what she did or her acts of betrayal, she was just a lonely woman who had fallen for a sophisticated intelligence operation designed specifically to exploit her emotional needs. After her release, Sharon Scranage effectively disappeared from the public eye. She returned to King George County to a community that had watched their local girl become embroiled in an international spy scandal. Decades later, the Sharon Scranage espionage scandal has continued to influence intelligence training, diplomatic relations, and our understanding of Cold War dynamics in Africa. Enhanced security screening for new recruits became standard, with more rigorous background checks and psychological evaluations. Improved counterintelligence awareness training also helped personnel to recognize honey trap vulnerabilities. Stricter operational security guidelines clarified rules about personal relationships during foreign assignments. As much as intelligence agencies might try to guard against this sort of thing from happening in future, human nature, being what it is, makes total prevention impossible. Sharon Scranage was the spy story that nobody saw coming. A love affair shattered America's intelligence network and reminded the world that even the most ordinary people could find themselves at the center of extraordinary international intrigue.
In 1985, the Cold War was entering its final throes. The policies of openness and reform by newly installed Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev marked the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. 1985 was also the year of the spy. This was owing to the dozen or so high-profile espionage cases that dominated American news headlines. One of the spies arrested that year stands out from among his peers. His story is remarkable not only for the quantity of secret material he delivered over his short spying career, but also for whom he delivered it to. Jonathan J. Pollard was a civilian intelligence analyst at the US Navy's Anti-Terrorist Alert Center in Maryland. He delivered the equivalent of 30 filing cabinets worth of top secret and classified material to Israel over an 18-month period. The revelation that a Jewish American had been run as a spy by Israeli intelligence on American soil sparked a major controversy and caused two allies to teeter on the edge of a diplomatic crisis. Pollard's arrest marked the beginning of a saga that would captivate and polarize opinions for decades. His imprisonment made him a symbol of one of the most contentious episodes in the history of American intelligence. Born on the 7th of August 1954, Jonathan Pollard was the youngest of three siblings. His father, Dr. Morris Pollard, was an accomplished microbiologist. Just prior to Jonathan's 8th birthday, his father accepted a position at Notre Dame University, and the Pollard family moved to South Bend in Indiana. Jonathan was an intelligent child who always had his nose in a book. He was teased, bullied, and beaten up at school, which he attributed to anti-Semitism. These circumstances led his parents to enroll him at a private Hebrew day school. The Pollard family was proudly Jewish, and Jonathan and his siblings grew up within a strong Jewish tradition and culture. At his new school, Jonathan started to develop a zeal for Judaism and established the foundation of his later Zionist beliefs. He observed Israel's existential crisis and ultimate victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, and shortly after his bar mitzvah, Jonathan visited the memorial site at the Dachau concentration camp, the notorious World War II Nazi death camp. These were experiences that left lasting imprints on him and heightened his sense of devotion to the Jewish people and the Israeli state. There is no doubt that young Jonathan Pollard was a gifted student. His abilities led him in 1970 to be awarded a chance to attend a science camp at the prestigious Weizmann Institute. His love for Israel grew exponentially during this period of his life, with Jonathan's mother having to convince him not to make Aliyah, that is, to return to the Jewish Holy Land. However, notwithstanding his ethnic and religious devotion, he had a penchant for mischief, getting involved in a fight while at the camp and being remembered by one of the scientists there as an unstable troublemaker. After graduating high school with honors, Jonathan enrolled at Stanford University. Here he developed a fantasy for espionage and a desire to become a secret agent. He bragged to his classmates about being a spy working for Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency. This was, of course, an outright lie, and just one of many examples of Pollard's compulsion to lie and spin tales of grandiose delusion. He took the story so far as to refer to himself as Colonel Pollard in his college yearbook. He graduated from Stanford with a political science degree and was then accepted into the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in Boston. There he attended for 2 years, flunking out after failing to complete several courses. Pollard had, however, by that stage, already decided that he wanted to pursue a career in intelligence. Pollard applied for a graduate fellowship position with the CIA, and as part of the interview process was required to take a polygraph examination. During the test, he admitted to using Thai sticks and hashish, and to smoking marijuana about 600 times during his university career. Understandably, he was turned down for the position. Undeterred, in 1979, Pollard applied to become an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Navy Field Operational Intelligence Office located in Suitland, Maryland. The position required top-secret and sensitive compartmented information security clearances. While Pollard had to undergo an extensive background information check, a polygraph test was this time not required. The check included a general request to other intelligence agencies for any information they had on record. The CIA, however, citing privacy concerns, declined to release the information they held on Pollard, including the results of his polygraph test. Had it done so, this story may have ended here. Pollard passed the background check and was given the job and assigned to the Naval Ocean Surveillance Information Center, where he monitored shipping traffic. Only a month or two into his job, Pollard approached one of his superiors with a proposal. He said that he had a contact in the South African government and that he could use this connection to run an operation against the then apartheid government. Pollard boasted to his superior that his father worked for the CIA and was the station chief at the American Embassy in South Africa. This was, of course, another brazen lie. The technical director to whom Pollard had made the proposal knew this to be false and recommended to the head of the agency that Pollard be terminated immediately since he was still serving his probationary period. Remarkably, the opposite occurred, with Pollard being assigned to a secret task force called Task Force 168, which collected human intelligence for the Navy. Pollard was distrusted by his superiors in TF 168, who began to second-guess the appointment. It was decided that a ruse would be pulled in order to compel Pollard to sit through a polygraph exam. He was told that he was being recruited as an agent to pursue his South African connection, but that he would have to pass a polygraph test first. When the test was administered, Pollard displayed bizarre behavior, shouting, gagging, and repeatedly running to the bathroom in between questions. Pollard was a nervous wreck, and after hours of attempting to question him in vain, the examiner had to abandon the test. While the test itself was inconclusive, the examiner stated categorically that Pollard should never be used as a double agent, nor should he be granted access to any sensitive or top-secret information. As a result, then Director of Naval Intelligence Rear Admiral Sumner Shapiro directed that Pollard be moved to a new position in the organization and one in which he would not require TS or SCI security clearance. Although still holding a secret security clearance, Pollard was incensed. He considered his higher clearance a status symbol and one which he wore as a badge of honor. He reverted to playing the professional victim, blaming the Navy for being anti-Semitic and sidelining him for this reason. He lodged a grievance with his employer and effectively went to war with the Navy. Eventually, and after threatening legal action, Pollard had his security clearance restored on the 19th of January 1982. This reinstatement, made reluctantly, was subject to quarterly monitoring and reporting by his line manager. These reports said that Pollard's performance was exemplary and that he was making a valued contribution to the NICS's mission. Eventually, however, and after personnel changes, the reporting and monitoring stopped. In 1981, Pollard met Anne Henderson, an attractive and intelligent 21-year-old woman from New York who worked in the press room of the National Rifle Association. The two soon fell in love and in 1982 moved in together in an apartment in Arlington, Virginia. Then followed a series of further red flags which were either missed or ignored by the Navy. These included Pollard getting into financial trouble and nearly being evicted from his apartment for failing to pay rent. After moving to the DuPont Circle area of Washington, D.C. in 1982, Pollard and Anne regularly smoked marijuana and took cocaine at various parties. On another occasion, Pollard had applied for a new position that opened up within the Navy. He arrived to the interview late and disheveled. He spun a story about his girlfriend Anne having been kidnapped by members of the Irish Republican Army, and that he had spent the weekend running around the Washington area negotiating for her release. Needless to say, Pollard didn't get the job, but the incident was never reported up the chain of command. Whether these incidents were not appropriately reported or were simply chalked up to personal eccentricities, Pollard continued to climb the bureaucratic ladder and was noted as being an intelligent and hard-working analyst. Yet J. Pollard was discontented. He grew increasingly concerned over the security position of his ethnic home, Israel. As a nation, Israel has since its creation in 1948 faced the unenviable position of being surrounded by enemies. Despite a series of US presidents describing the relationship between Israel and the USA as a special friendship, Pollard believed that his country of birth was not doing enough to protect its ally. Friendly relations between Israel and the USA suffered a setback in June of 1981 when the Israeli Air Force executed a coordinated attack against Osirak in Iraq, a nuclear reactor facility. The operation was a major success, with Saddam Hussein's nuclear capabilities completely neutralized. However, the US and other nations considered the move a violation of international law. For a period after this event, US intelligence began to withhold certain information from its Israeli ally for fear that it would act on it in a similar fashion. It would take 2 years for the countries to formally restore their strategic channels of communication, with US President Ronald Reagan signing an agreement with Israel concerning bilateral information exchange in 1983. Pollard, however, believed that the US was not keeping up its end of the bargain and was withholding information relating to key aspects of Israeli national security. He considered his options and was torn between, on the one hand, immigrating to Israel and taking with him what information he could carry, or, on the other, remaining as an analyst in the US and using his security clearance to provide classified material to Israel. Needless to say, he opted for the latter option, which had the added benefit of allowing him to live out his fantasy of being a secret agent. Circumstances would soon allow Jonathan Pollard to pursue his goal. On the 18th of April 1983, a lone suicide bomber drove a truck filled with explosives into the US Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people. Then, 6 months later, on the 23rd of October 1983, a Hezbollah terrorist drove a truck packed with TNT into the US Marine Amphibious Unit compound at Beirut International Airport. The detonation killed 220 Marines, 21 other service members, and injured another 100 people. In response to these attacks, the Naval Investigative Service established a new intelligence unit called the Anti-Terrorist Alert Center, or ATAC. Pollard was initially transferred for a 6-month period to ATAC, and then on the 14th of October 1984 was hired as a permanent employee. The ATAC was designed to have computer links to all the US military intelligence collection commands. Pollard found himself, therefore, with virtually unlimited access to all highly classified information stored within the CIA, NSA, and FBI databases, among others. He was also given a courier card, which allowed him to carry classified materials on his person anywhere in the Washington, D.C. area without fear of being searched. For an aspiring double agent, Pollard could have chosen no better place. It was around this time that Pollard was contacted by a friend of his, Stephen Stern. Stephen was a wealthy New York stockbroker. The two men would discuss business opportunities and the current state of affairs in Israel. During one such discussion, Stephen mentioned to Jonathan that he had attended a conference where he listened to a speaker by the name of Colonel Aviem Sela. The colonel was studying for his PhD in New York at the time, and Stern wanted to make an introduction. Pollard knew exactly who Colonel Sela was, an Israeli war hero and a national icon. He was in fact the fighter pilot that led the 1981 attack on Osirak and had also gained fame for shooting down as many as 90 Syrian MiG fighter planes in the 1982 war in Lebanon. Pollard knew immediately that this was his golden opportunity to offer his services to Israel. He gratefully accepted the invitation and immediately rushed to tell his girlfriend Anne about the good turn of events. Pollard had only just started working at his new position at ATAC when one evening he received a telephone call from Colonel Sela. The two men arranged to meet at the Washington Hilton Hotel in May of 1984. Despite all his military accomplishments, Aviem Sela was no spy runner. He had no experience in human intelligence or espionage, but knew that he was dealing with a potentially delicate matter. Through a civilian contact stationed at Israel's New York consulate, Sela got in touch with Lakam, an Israeli agency tasked with gathering scientific intelligence. This was an agency much smaller in scale and reach than Israel's more well-known intelligence centers, Mossad and the Shabak. It was, however, headed by one of Israel's preeminent spy masters, Raphael Rafi Eitan, famous for his role in capturing notorious Nazi leader Adolf Eichmann. Eitan gave his blessing to Sela for the meeting to go ahead, but advised that he proceed with caution. Walk-ins always had to be treated with circumspection. Who knew? Pollard may have been a plant by one of its rival intelligence agencies. Yet even if he wasn't, the fallout, should Israel be discovered to even be considering spying against its closest ally, would be catastrophic. The first meeting between Jonathan Pollard and Aviem Seller went ahead on the 24th of May 1984. The two men immediately found common ground in their shared love for Israel and a growing concern for its welfare. Pollard wasted no time in telling Seller the kind of information he had access to at work, which to Seller sounded almost too good to be true. As a test, Seller requested to see a small sample of the type of intelligence Pollard had access to. To arrange their next meeting, Seller told Pollard that he would call him at home and mention a Hebrew letter. This directed Pollard to one of the several payphones located near to his home, which had been assigned that specific letter. A week later, Pollard and Seller met again at the Hilton Hotel, but then traveled together to a park adjoining the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library in Georgetown. Pollard had brought with him a briefcase stuffed with classified material, including a 3-volume series on Saudi Arabian ground forces and a ground logistics study. But what clinched the deal was when Pollard pulled out satellite photos of the Osirak site following the Israeli operation. Seller was amazed. He had never seen the fruit of his labors for which he had gained so much fame. Any doubts that he had about Pollard immediately evaporated. A third meeting was soon arranged for the 21st of July 1984 at the Holiday Inn in Chevy Chase, Maryland. This time, Pollard brought with him 2 large suitcases packed to bursting with classified and top-secret documents. Seller and Pollard traveled together in a rental car to a house on Deborah Street in Potomac, Maryland. This was a house owned by Ilan Ravid, the attaché for scientific affairs at the Israeli embassy in Washington. The documents Pollard had brought with him, marked TS or SCI, and which Pollard had to return to his office by the next Monday morning, were photographed and handed back to him. At this meeting, Pollard was told that he would be required to travel to Paris that November to meet the man in charge of the whole operation. The compensation to be paid to Pollard for his efforts was also discussed, it being loosely agreed that he would be paid the equivalent of his annual salary working for the NIS, which was $1,000 per month. By this stage, Pollard and Anne had gotten engaged. This was used as the cover story for his trip to Paris. Anne was to accompany Jonathan, with the couple posing as lovebirds on vacation to purchase an engagement ring and celebrate their upcoming nuptials. Pollard could never have afforded the trip and the engagement ring on his federal salary, and so he invented a fictitious wealthy uncle whom he named Joe Fisher. Uncle Joe was not able to attend the wedding, and so generously paid for the couple's holiday, along with an expensive sapphire and diamond engagement ring. Pollard was told not to tell Anne the true reason for their trip, but that horse had already bolted. Although he assured Seller that Anne knew nothing, Pollard was telling Anne every last detail about his new career as a double agent. The couple journeyed to Paris in November 1984. They stayed at the expensive Paris Hilton International Hotel and dined at expensive restaurants, all on the account of the Israelis. Pollard was also introduced to Yosef Yossi Yeager, who he later learned was the scientific attaché to the Israeli consulate in New York City. For 3 days, while the men discussed operational planning and tasking, Anne was taken on shopping trips, which included the purchase of the engagement ring. Once business had been attended to, Lacam sponsored a 3-week tour of Europe for Pollard and his fiancée. Returning to the US flush with cash and very much in love, Jonathan and Anne blew their newfound money on food, drink, and drugs. For the next 18 months, Pollard's spying went into overdrive. He provided the Israelis with reams of classified material pilfered from his office in Suitland. Every Friday, Pollard would cram his briefcase full of classified materials, which he would take to his 1980 Ford Mustang, sometimes doing this multiple times in the day. He then transferred the documents to suitcases, often while parked at a nearby car wash. Pollard then rendezvoused with Seller and other Lacam agents twice a week. The meetings were moved to an apartment nearer the Israeli embassy, which was home to Embassy Secretary Irit Erb. Pollard would also meet Yeager on the last Saturday of each month at Erb's apartment to be given a shopping list of further documents that they required and to discuss the value of the previous delivery. The primary information Israel was after concerned the military and nuclear capabilities of Pakistan and Israel's Arab neighbors. The Israelis also chiefly wanted to learn about the assistance those countries were receiving from the Soviet Union. Pollard and his handlers proceeded with reckless abandon. They didn't follow any form of standard spycraft, such as dry cleaning en route to their meetings, or arranging dead drops to exchange information. They assumed nobody would ever suspect that the Israelis had recruited an American spy, and they were exactly right. On one occasion, in January 1985, Pollard returned to his office after hours to remove multiple boxes filled with secret documents. Given his courier card, he was not questioned by the on-duty security guard, who even placed a block to stop the door from closing behind Pollard as he went to and from his car. Several Xerox machines were installed at the Israeli apartment to copy the most sensitive documents which Pollard had to return to his office. As the operation ramped up, Rafi Eitan decided it was time to replace Colonel Seller with a seasoned spy runner. Enter Uzi. The man whose true name was Yaakov Nimrodi was an international arms dealer and well-versed in the art of espionage. He was charged with being Jonathan Pollard's new handler. In the summer of 1985, Jonathan and Anne made a second overseas trip, this time to Israel. Pollard was growing ever more anxious as he met with his handlers in Tel Aviv. It was the year of the spy, after all. American spies and double agents were being rounded up left, right, and center. The members of the Walker spy ring had just been arrested in May of 1985. Pollard worried that he would be next. He was devastated to learn that Rafi Eitan intended to continue the operation for another 10 years. In convincing a nervous Pollard to sign up to this deal, his compensation was increased to $2,500 per month. He was also promised an Israeli passport and was told that to secure his eventual retirement in Israel, $30,000 would be deposited annually into a Swiss bank account for the next 10 years. He also didn't have to worry about his upcoming wedding in Venice and European honeymoon. That too would be paid for. Finally, Pollard was given assurances that he would be taken care of if he was ever discovered. After all, Israel and the USA were close allies, and a small matter of spying between friends was nothing a little bit of quiet diplomacy couldn't sort out. Somewhat assuaged, and with dollar signs in their eyes, Jonathan and Anne set off for Venice, where they were married on the 9th of August 1985. They then enjoyed a lavish honeymoon across Europe and London, returning to the United States as husband and wife a few weeks later. Jonathan Pollard immediately picked up where he left off, stealing every secret document he could lay his hands on. While sense would dictate that Pollard would have tried to keep a low profile, he couldn't resist telling tall tales to his colleagues. On one occasion, he spun another story about Anne being kidnapped, this time from a gun show, and that she was being held hostage in a nearby motel. To another colleague, Pollard claimed to have been taken prisoner in Damascus and tortured by the Syrians. He boasted about having a degree in advanced mathematics and continued to spin the false story of his father working for the CIA. His work performance began to drop, and this combined with his persistent fibbing resulted in Pollard being given a verbal warning. He was also quick to flaunt his security clearance to impress anybody who cared to listen. On several occasions, Pollard handed classified documents to people in his social circle. This included copies of economic and political analyses, which he gave to 2 investment advisor friends. He also wanted to get into the arms trade, just like Uzi. He tried to pass secret materials to Kurt Lobeck, a freelance journalist covering the Soviet-Afghan War, whom he tried to enlist in an arms trafficking scheme. Given his careless approach and constant braggadocio, Pollard's luck in remaining undetected was bound to only last for so long. On Friday, the 8th of November 1985, a co-worker spotted Pollard removing documents marked TS-SCI from the office. This in itself ought not to have raised suspicions given Pollard's courier card, but the co-worker overheard Pollard earlier in the day saying that he intended to destroy the documents which he had requested in error. Only a few minutes later, the co-worker spotted Pollard handing the same bundle of documents to his wife Anne outside the building in the parking lot. This incident was reported up the chain of command, eventually making its way onto the desks of NIS and FBI investigators. Pollard's concerns had been realized. Vigilance and security awareness within military and naval intelligence was heightened in the wake of the Walker-Whitworth espionage case. Pollard was also observed to be showing unusual interest in matters in the Middle East, whereas his role related to intelligence gathering and analysis in the Americas and the Caribbean. He was acting erratically and his work standards were continuously dropping. He generally gave the impression of being a disgruntled employee. The FBI were concerned enough to start an investigation. They authorized the installation of pinhole cameras around Pollard's office cubicle. He was watched round the clock and was followed when leaving the office parking lot. The NIS's own internal investigator, Ronald Pelton, was also put on the case. The surveillance would have paid off had somebody been monitoring the video feed on the morning of the 15th of November 1985. The cameras were not watched for a crucial 3-minute period when Pollard stuffed as many as 3,000 pages of classified material into his briefcase. Nevertheless, investigators knew that Pollard would likely attempt to leave the office the following Monday with another bundle of classified documents. This is when they intended to close in. On Monday, the 18th of November 1985, plans were afoot to intercept Jonathan Pollard at the end of the workday. He was seen on the hidden cameras packaging a bundle of classified documents. As he approached his car carrying the package, he was intercepted by 2 FBI agents. There wasn't enough evidence to arrest Pollard at that stage, and so investigators needed him to speak to them voluntarily. He was asked to return inside to answer some questions. Appearing confused, Pollard thought better of refusing and agreed to return inside. Then followed an interview that would last long into the night. Pollard had an answer for everything and admitted nothing. His story was that he was in fact wanting a second opinion on the classified documents from an analyst friend working for another US intelligence agency. The FBI agents were trying to get Pollard to agree to a permissive search of his apartment. They had no warrant and were at that stage entirely dependent on Pollard's cooperation. As minutes turned to hours, the investigators realized that they couldn't hold Pollard for much longer. He wasn't under arrest and was free to leave at any time. He also wasn't budging from his position of denial and avoidance. He was due that night to meet Colonel Seller along with his wife for dinner. Pollard requested to phone Anne to let her know that he was running late. This he did, telling Anne over the phone to go on without him and that she should take the cactus, you know, the one that they had bought for their friend's birthday, and not to forget the wedding album. This was Pollard giving his wife Anne a pre-agreed code to let her know that he was in trouble. This was her signal to remove or destroy any classified documents that were being stored at their apartment. On the other end of the line, Anne quickly hung up and got to work. She filled a suitcase with all the documents she could find lying around the flat, and convinced a neighbor to hold onto the suitcase for the time being. She contacted Seller and told him that Jay was in trouble. Colonel Seller had no intention of hanging around and jumped on the first plane back to Israel. Jonathan and Anne would have done well to do the same. Back at ATAC offices, investigators took a break from the interview. As Pollard was returning from the restroom, he bumped into NIS Special Agent Olive. Using his best good cop routine, Olive suggested to Pollard that he agree to a cursory search of his apartment. After all, he had nothing to hide, right? Better to dispel the cloud of suspicion that was hanging over his head than risk a lengthy investigation. Reluctantly, Jonathan Pollard agreed. Agent Olive and the 2 FBI agents went immediately to Jay Pollard's apartment. He was counting on Anne to have stashed away any incriminating evidence. She arrived a few minutes later, breathless and agitated after stashing the heavy suitcase of documents with the neighbor. Jonathan and Anne sat on a couch while investigators tore through their apartment. Both must have been mortified when a pile of 60-odd classified documents were brought out from their bedroom, which were found in a box under a pile of dirty laundry in the closet. Jay Pollard, of course, had an answer for everything. He was a hard-working analyst. He worked long hours and sometimes brought home classified documents to work on after hours. Pollard agreed, despite his prior experiences, to take a polygraph test. In a bizarre turn of events, the FBI withdrew from the matter at that point,
telling NIS to deal with it internally. After Agent Olive and the others left the Pollard apartment that night, Jay and Anne raced to a nearby 24-hour coffee shop to regroup and plan their next move. They tried to call Aviam Seller, but received an answer from Joseph Jager. He told Jonathan to stall the investigators for 72 hours and hung up. Pollard assumed that this was how much time was needed to implement a rescue plan. But oh, how wrong he was. The next day, Tuesday, the 19th of November, Jonathan Pollard tried to avoid the polygraph test by calling in sick. After being convinced to still take the test, Pollard arrived at the office wanting to first speak to Agent Olive. While somewhat unconventional, it was decided that Agent Olive would interview Pollard. His story was at first that the documents he had taken related to possible arms smuggling to Afghanistan through South Africa. The documents, Pollard said, he had supplied to freelance journalist Kurt Lobeck. Agent Olive wasn't buying this story, but he allowed Pollard to ramble on. He initially denied receiving any compensation, but eventually admitted to receiving $2,500 a month for his efforts. Agent Olive then broke the meeting to inform the FBI that they were dealing with a full-blown case of espionage. When the meeting resumed, now with an FBI agent in tow, Jay Pollard signed an 11-page confession detailing his crimes. The confession was, however, a mix of half-truths and outright lies, making no mention of the Israelis. The investigators needed more before making an arrest. The interview was adjourned for the night and Pollard was driven home. He and Anne were surveilled, but not closely enough, as it turned out. Pollard managed to evade his minders and got to a nearby payphone that night. After trying unsuccessfully to reach Jager, he contacted the Israeli embassy. He desperately wanted an update on the plan to extract him and Anne. Meanwhile, investigators were tipped off as to the suitcase full of classified documents, which was quickly retrieved and later searched. As fate would have it, Pollard's interview would never resume. Anne was suffering from a medical condition and was due to undergo a minor procedure in hospital the next day. Jay and Anne decided it was time to make a run for it. They had waited 72 hours, but the Israelis had not made contact. On the morning of Thursday, the 21st of November, Jonathan and Anne loaded their packed suitcases into the car and left their apartment building, managing again to evade FBI surveillance. Jonathan called the Israeli embassy from a payphone, and he was told that, provided he could shake off the FBI tail, they would be allowed refuge inside. After Anne's procedure at the hospital that morning, the FBI followed Jonathan's 1980 Mustang as it left the premises. They assumed that he would be returning to their apartment, but instead, Pollard led the investigators on a wild goose chase across the city, going this way then that, in an attempt to shake off the tail. Eventually, Pollard turned the car into a compound. When the agents realized that Pollard had entered the Israeli embassy, they were stunned. They didn't know at that stage which foreign power Pollard was supplying to, perhaps the Soviets, maybe one of the Arab countries, but the thought that a close ally was involved had never even entered their minds. Agents looked on helplessly as the embassy gates shut behind Pollard's vehicle. They saw Pollard exit the car and an exchange occurred between him and a guard. As a few minutes ticked by, the area outside the embassy began to swarm with police and FBI activity. But then, Pollard, appearing exasperated, got back into his car and turned it around. As he rolled out onto the street, he was immediately apprehended and taken into custody. Jonathan J. Pollard had just then joined the ranks of spies having been left out in the cold. He was taken immediately to a nearby FBI field office. Anne hadn't yet been implicated in any wrongdoing and was thus free to go. Crying hysterically, she was driven back to her apartment. She was arrested the next day after the situation involving the suitcase was brought to light. The news of the arrests soon broke and the American public was stunned. Yet another double agent had been discovered in the so-called Year of the Spy. The scene was thus set for a period of tense relations between the US and Israel. For the first 3 days following Pollard's arrest, Israel remained strangely silent. Much to the US State Department's chagrin,
The Israelis immediately withdrew Yossi Yagur and Ilan Ravid from the Israeli embassy to avoid them being subjected to questioning. The American public were growing accustomed to learning about Soviet spies, but how could a small Middle Eastern state that was meant to be an ally have penetrated US intelligence? Hotly debated was the question of whether those with dual national loyalties should be permitted to work in US national security. Only on the 24th of November 1985 did Israel's foreign ministry release a statement. All that was said was that any act of espionage against the United States stood in total contradiction to Israeli policy. There was a promise of cooperation, with Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres promising to return any classified material that had been received from Pollard. Apart from this, Israel's leadership remained silent. All the while, US intelligence scrambled to establish how long Pollard had been a spy and the extent of the damage he may have caused. When Israel finally did break cover a few days later, its official position was that Pollard had been run as a rogue operation without the knowledge or consent of the highest echelons of Israeli political leadership. With tensions simmering, the US demanded more answers. The US Justice Department sent a delegation to Israel where those involved in the Pollard affair were interviewed in a secret location near a Tel Aviv military base. Those interviewed were promised immunity from prosecution in exchange for a full debriefing. The Israelis handed back only 163 documents they had received from Pollard, which was only a tiny fraction of the total number. Back in the United States, Jonathan Pollard was feeling bereft and abandoned. As the evidence against him was now overwhelming, and he had already partly admitted his espionage, he decided his best option was to fully cooperate with the authorities in the hopes of receiving leniency. After consulting with their attorneys, Jay and Ann Pollard decided to plea bargain. On the 4th of June 1986, Jonathan Pollard pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage. He confirmed that he was aware that the maximum sentence for such an offense was life in prison and a $250,000 penalty. Anne pleaded guilty to conspiracy to receive embezzled government property and accessory after the fact to possession of national defense documents. After their pleas were entered, a later date was arranged for a sentencing hearing. Jonathan was remanded to jail, whereas Anne was released on bond on medical grounds. The two plea agreements reached between prosecutors and the Pollards recorded the US government's agreement not to seek the maximum sentence of life imprisonment. Among these conditions were that Jonathan Pollard agreed to submit to a full debriefing and damage assessment, and, crucially, that he and Anne would not speak publicly about the matter without the prior permission of the Director of Naval Intelligence. During his extensive debriefing, Pollard was first to name Aviem Seller as being involved. Beyond his spying for Israel, Pollard also admitted to passing classified information, albeit on a comparatively smaller scale, to officials of other foreign governments, including apartheid South Africa. In the lead-up to the sentencing hearing, the defense and the prosecution exchanged various memoranda in aid of sentencing to Judge Aubrey Robinson. In a contentious move, Pollard submitted a 61-page memorandum in which he claimed to have spied to save Israel and to cause damage to the Soviet Union. He denied becoming a spy for financial gain, saying rather that he was motivated by the constant anti-Semitism he experienced in his daily life. On the 19th of January 1987, U.S. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger filed a lengthy classified memorandum which detailed the extent of the damage that Pollard had caused to U.S. national security. In what became known as the Weinberger Memorandum, the sheer volume of material Pollard made off with in 18 months was emphasized, enough to fill a room of 6 by 6 by 10 feet. Weinberger highlighted how dangerous it can be for classified information to be passed on, even to an ally, for who knows what other third parties may come into possession of it. There are those that believe Israel repackaged some of the intelligence they received from Pollard, passing it on to the Soviet Union in prisoner exchanges, and to allow for the continued immigration to Israel of Jews living in the Soviet Union. Then, just weeks before the sentencing hearing, Pollard agreed to be interviewed by Wolf Blitzer, a journalist at the time for the Jerusalem Post. On the 15th of February 1987, Blitzer's article titled "Pollard, Not a Bumbler but Israel's Master Spy" was published in the Washington Post. The article included details of classified materials Pollard had disclosed to Israel, including satellite photos of the Palestinian Liberation Organization headquarters in Tunisia and information concerning the military capabilities of various Arab nations. This was a clear breach of his plea deal, and prosecutors were incensed. They chose not, however, to file papers with the court advising of Pollard's reneging of the plea agreement. To make matters worse, Anne appeared on CBS's 60 Minutes on the 1st of March 1987, where she was interviewed by investigative reporter Mike Wallace. This was just 3 days prior to the sentencing hearing. The interview, intended by Anne and Jonathan to curry favor with the public and justify their actions, backfired spectacularly. Following the Blitzer interview, Defense Secretary Weinberger filed a supplementary memorandum in which he summed up his view of the harm caused by Pollard. He said, "It is difficult for me, even in the so-called Year of the Spy, to conceive of a greater harm to national security than that caused by the defendant in view of the breadth, the critical importance to the United States, and the high sensitivity of the information he sold to Israel." On the 4th of March 1987, Jonathan Pollard was sentenced to life imprisonment. Anne was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Pollard's sentence immediately sparked controversy, with many considering the US government to have reneged on the plea deal by seeking a life sentence. Many were shocked by the severity of the sentence, given that many other US spies who had spied for the Soviet Union had got off far more lightly. In truth, what prosecutors had agreed with Pollard was to bring to the court's attention the nature, extent, and value of his cooperation in the investigation. Prosecutors still, however, recommended to the court that it impose a substantial period of incarceration and a monetary fine. It always remained within the judge's discretion to impose a sentence which could never be limited by any plea deal. In the media, opinions from Pollard's sympathizers and critics spanned the full gamut, portraying him in turn either as a selfless hero or a self-aggrandizing criminal. In Mark Shaw's Miscarriage of Justice, the author emphasized the disproportionality of Pollard's sentence, painting him as an intelligent but desperate and overly idealistic naval analyst. In The Hunting Horse, The Truth Behind the Jonathan Pollard Spy Case, Elliot Goldberg argued that Pollard was merely a scapegoat in a massive US effort to cover up its dealings with Saddam Hussein and his chemical weapons arsenal. In contrast, Agent Ronald Olive, the NIS investigator who played a key role in uncovering Pollard's espionage, wrote in his book, Capturing Jonathan Pollard, that he was greedy, arrogant, and unrepentant, the damage he caused being incalculable and colossal. Following sentencing, Pollard was moved around the U.S. prison system until being transferred to the Butner Federal Correction Complex in North Carolina. This is where he served the majority of his sentence. Anne Pollard served just 3.5 years of her 5-year sentence before being released on parole due to her ongoing health condition. After release, she immigrated to Israel. Despite campaigning for her husband's release, she received divorce papers from Jonathan out of the blue, seeking separation on the basis that their marriage had irretrievably broken down. Pollard soon remarried Esther Elaine Zeitz, a Canadian schoolteacher who had also campaigned for clemency. As Jonathan languished in jail year after year, support for him, both domestically in the United States and in Israel, began to mount. It was only in 1998 that Israel formally acknowledged Pollard as having been their spy. A formal proclamation said Jonathan Pollard had acted as an official Israeli agent, handled by those serving as high-ranking senior officials of the Israeli Bureau for Scientific Relations. While still in jail, Pollard was granted Israeli citizenship. He failed in all appeals to have his sentencing overturned, and a succession of US presidents declined to grant clemency or to commute his sentence. Pollard even found himself being used as a bargaining chip in then US Secretary of State John Kerry's attempt to broker a Middle Eastern peace deal in 2014, but that too came to nothing. After spending 30 years behind bars, Jonathan Pollard was released on parole in 2015. His parole was subject to strict conditions, including that he live within the New York area, have limited to no access to the internet, report regularly to his parole officer, and wear an ankle bracelet. Once his parole conditions expired in 2020, Pollard realized his lifelong ambition to make Aliyah and immigrated to Israel with his wife Esther on the 30th of December 2020. Upon his arrival in Israel, he kissed the tarmac and was welcomed as a national hero by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Today, Pollard remains living in Israel. His second wife, Esther, sadly passed away of COVID in January 2022. Jonathan makes interview appearances on TV and gives keynote speeches telling of his life and experiences. He remains a celebrated hero in his new home, while his legacy of betrayal in the United States lives on, nearly 40 years later. The United States and Israel were able to put the Pollard saga behind them, although both sides likely remain more vigilant than before. During Pollard's many debriefings and polygraph exams, a common line of questioning was whether any others were involved in his espionage activities. Conspiracy theories circulated concerning a mysterious Mr. X, a shadowy top US government official rumored to be the kingpin in a much larger network of spies. Occam's razor would suggest, however, that this is an unlikely scenario. As with all spies and double agents, the factors and circumstances that led Jonathan Pollard to spy are varied. In his own mind, he was justified in what he did. In the mind of the law, he committed a criminal act and received a just punishment.